Hey guys, before we begin, let yourself settle. Shift a little, if you need to. Let whatever you are carrying today loosen its grip. You don't need to hold on to any of it now. Tonight we're stepping into the palaces of old Vienna, following a young bride from the Bavarian countryside into the rigid, glittering world of the Habsburg court. We'll walk with her through the ceremonies and the silences, the diamond crowns and the locked doors, the rules that wrapped around her life one layer at a time. There's nothing to keep track of. The story moves slowly, and it will be here whether you're awake for all of it or not. If these quiet journeys into the past help you rest, you're warmly welcome to subscribe to the channel so that another night like this one will be waiting whenever you need it. A thought left in the comments about where you're listening from tonight, or what part of history you'd like to fall asleep to next, is always a kind thing. But none of that needs to happen now. It can wait until morning, or it can wait forever. For now, there is just this room, and your breathing, and the slow weight of the night settling in around you. So let your eyes close whenever they want to. Let your breath find its own pace. And when you're ready, we'll step onto the banks of the Danube, where the water is dark and the morning has not yet come. In the summer of 1853, in a lakeside house in Bavaria, there was a girl who did not yet know what was about to happen to her. She was 15. She had bare feet more often than shoes. She spoke in dialect and spent her days swimming, climbing, feeding the horses, scribbling little poems nobody asked for. Her father was technically a duke, but you wouldn't have known it from the way the household ran. There were no rigid meal times, no protocol officers, no one standing behind her chair to tell her how to hold a fork. She was, by the standards of the ruling families of Europe, practically feral. And then one afternoon, at a family gathering in the mountain town of Bad Ischl, the young Emperor of Austria looked at her across the room and decided she would be his wife. She didn't say no. She couldn't have said no. But something in her understood, even then, that the life she had known was already over. Within a year, she'd be standing inside the Hofburg in Vienna, 17 years old, wearing a diamond crown that weighed more than her breakfast, surrounded by hundreds of aristocrats she had never met, not one of whom was permitted to speak to her unless she spoke first, and she was too frightened to open her mouth. So the room stood in silence, and everyone watched, and the silence was the loudest thing in the palace. That's tonight's story. Not a war, not a scandal, not a rise and fall. Just the slow, quiet machinery of a court that had been running the same way for centuries, and a girl who walked into it and found that everything she touched had a rule attached to it. How she was allowed to greet people and how she wasn't. What time she woke and who decided that. Who dressed her, and how long it took, and why the dressing alone could fill half a morning. The 3 hours every day that belonged entirely to her hair. The corset that took an hour to lace. The meals she learned to skip. The gymnastics rings she hung from in silk gowns behind locked doors, because even the way she moved her own body had become someone else's business. It's a strange thing being the most powerful woman in an empire and having almost no say in how your own day unfolds. The rules weren't cruel exactly. They weren't meant to punish anyone. They were just old and heavy, and no one had thought to ask whether the person inside them could breathe. We'll walk with her tonight. Through the ceremony rooms and the dressing chambers, through the ballrooms where Strauss played while she stood still as marble, through the small private hours when the doors were finally shut and the hair was finally unbraided and the diamonds were finally put away. We'll watch what happened to a girl who loved lakes and horses and open air, when every window around her was sealed with protocol and every door opened only on schedule. Let's begin where she began. In a quiet house on the water, where no one was watching, and the morning smelled like hay. There's a lake in Bavaria called the Starnberger Sea. It sits in a wide green valley south of Munich, ringed by low hills and old trees, and in the middle of the 19th century, on a stretch of its western shore, there stood a house called Possenhofen. It wasn't grand. It had the look of a summer place that someone had quietly decided to live in all year round. A little weathered, a little overgrown, the gardens not quite kept up to the standard you'd expect from a ducal family. Ivy crawled over the lower windows, the stables smelled of warm straw and leather, and the particular sweetness of horses that have just been rubbed down after a ride. Somewhere inside there were parrots and dogs, and at least one monkey that had the run of the upstairs hallway, because no one had managed to catch it yet. This is where Elizabeth grew up, and if you want to understand what happened to her later, the diamonds, the silence, the locked doors of the Hofburg, you have to start here, in the long grass by the water, where none of that existed yet. She was one of 8 children. The family was technically royal. Her father, Duke Max in Bavaria, held his title through the Wittelsbach line, the same ancient house that produced the kings of Bavaria. But Duke Max had very little interest in behaving like a duke. He had no official role at the Munich court, no political responsibilities, no ceremonies to attend unless he felt like attending them. He lived on an appanage of 250,000 gulden a year, which was an extraordinary sum, enough to fund a small army, enough to keep a family in luxury for generations, and he spent it exactly as he pleased. He played the zither, and played it well enough that he sometimes performed alongside the folk musicians in the taverns outside Munich, sitting among the farmers and the tradesmen as though he belonged there. He travelled constantly. He rode out early in the mornings and came back smelling of pine and wood smoke. He brought home animals from his trips, parrots, monkeys, dogs of every size and temperament, and let them roam the house until Ludovica, his wife, couldn't stand it anymore. He taught his daughters to ride hard and climb fast and jump like chamois over fences and ditches. He wanted them to be fearless, and they were. They could handle a horse before they could handle a hairpin. They fell off fences and got back up without crying, because crying was not how things were done at Possenhofen. The whole household ran on this principle, that the body was meant to be used, and the outdoors was better than the indoors, and if you came home with torn stockings and a scrape on your chin, that was a better day than one spent sitting in a drawing room. What he didn't teach them was how to sit still at a formal dinner, or how to curtsy to a bishop, or how to hold a conversation with someone you'd never met while 40 people watched. That was fine. Nobody expected anything different from this particular branch of the Wittelsbachs. They were the eccentric cousins, the ones who showed up at family gatherings smelling of horse and lake water, the ones whose children could outrun any farmhand in the valley but couldn't manage a proper French sentence if their lives depended on it. Ludovica worried about this sometimes. She was more serious than her husband, more aware of what the world expected from people of their rank. But even she had given up trying to impose much structure on the household. Duke Max was seldom home, and when he was home he wasn't interested in schedules or lessons or the painstaking work of turning wild children into presentable ones. The children did as they liked, and what they liked was being outside, swimming in the lake before the sun was fully up, riding without saddles through the fields behind the house, climbing the wooded hills until their clothes were torn and their shoes were ruined, and the cook was shouting from the kitchen door that supper had gone cold. Elisabeth, Sisi as everyone called her, was the second daughter, and in those early years not the one anyone noticed. Her older sister Aline was the beauty of the family, the one with the elegant bearing and the careful education, the one their mother was grooming for a significant marriage. Sisi was the other one, the one with the round face and the dark blonde braids and the slightly melancholy eyes that didn't quite fit with the rest of her, which was all energy and movement and bare feet on wet grass. She liked being alone. She liked the edge of the lake in the early morning, when the mist was still sitting on the water and the house behind her was just beginning to stir. A shutter opening, a dog barking once and going quiet, the faint clatter of the kitchen coming to life. She kept a notebook, little poems, fragments of thoughts, nothing she showed to anyone. She had a gentleness about her, a quickness of feeling that set her apart from her rougher siblings. But she could ride as hard as any of them, and she could swim farther, and when she came home at the end of the day with her hair tangled and her dress streaked with mud, she looked no different from the village children she'd been playing with. Ludovica, writing to relatives in Saxony about possible matches for her daughters, described Sisi with startling bluntness. "She's fresh," she said. "She's lively, but she hasn't got a single pretty feature. Not one." I keep thinking about that. A mother writing those words about her own daughter, putting them down on paper and sending them across the country to strangers. It sounds harsh, and maybe it was. But it was also honest in the way that royal mothers had to be honest when the business of marriage was at stake. Beauty was currency. A princess without it was a princess without leverage, and Ludovica knew the market. She had already sent Sisi to Dresden to meet the eligible princes of the Saxon court, and Sisi had come home without a single offer. Not pretty enough, not polished enough, not enough of anything that mattered in the quiet arithmetic of dynastic matchmaking. So she went back to the lake, back to the horses, back to writing little poems in a notebook that nobody asked to read. She swam in the Starnberger Sea when the water was still cold enough to take her breath away. her body cutting through the dark surface while the hills stood perfectly still around her. She climbed the wooded paths behind Possenhofen with the village children, who were her friends in a way that would have scandalised any proper court, not because she was unkind to them or patronising, but because she treated them as equals, which was far worse in the eyes of the aristocracy. She spoke Bavarian dialect with them, broad and warm and full of sounds that would have made a Viennese countess wince. She had no idea really what life was like for people who lived inside protocol. It had never touched her. The rules of the great courts of Europe were something that happened to other people, far away, behind walls she had never seen. And here's the thing about that freedom. It wasn't accidental. Duke Max had built it deliberately, this little world where his children could grow up unpolished and unsupervised, and entirely themselves. He'd looked at the stiff courts of Europe, the uniforms, the ceremonies, the interminable audiences where you stood for hours saying nothing that mattered, and he decided he wanted no part of it. His children would ride, they would swim, they would learn what their bodies could do and what the natural world looked like up close, and they would not learn to curtsy until someone made them. It was a gift, and it was also, in the end, a kind of trap. Because the very qualities that made Possenhofen so free, the absence of protocol, the contempt for formality, the deep belief that a person's worth had nothing to do with their title, were exactly the qualities that would make the Viennese court unbearable for the girl who'd grown up there. Max had raised a daughter who could outswim a stable boy and compose a verse before lunch, but who had no idea how to stand in a room full of strangers and let them stare at her without flinching. He'd given her the hills and the horses and the open sky, and he hadn't given her a single tool for surviving the world that was about to close around her, like the lacing of a corset. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In the summer of 1853, none of that had happened yet. The Austrian Empire in that year was the second largest state in Europe. It stretched from the Alps to the Carpathians, from the coast of the Adriatic to the flat frozen plains of Galicia, holding together 40 million people who spoke a dozen languages and agreed on almost nothing, except that they were all, for the moment, subjects of the young emperor in Vienna. 8.5 million Germans, 16 million Slavs, 6 million Italians, 5 million Hungarians, nearly 3 million Romanians, about 1 million Jews, roughly 100,000 Roma. They farmed, most of them farmed. 29 million of them lived off the land, growing flax and hemp and grapes and grain, working the soil the same way their grandparents had worked it, with tools and methods that hadn't changed in centuries. The technical revolution that was remaking England and France had barely touched this empire. It was vast and it was old, and it ran on tradition the way a water wheel runs on a river, slowly, steadily, and with the quiet assumption that the river would never stop. Franz Joseph had come to the throne at 18, in the chaos of the 1848 revolutions, after his uncle Ferdinand, who was by most accounts not well enough to govern, abdicated and his own father quietly stepped aside. He was 23 now, blonde, slim, with a soft face, and very good manners, always in uniform, always composed. He danced well. He worked long hours at his desk. He ruled without a parliament, without a constitution, with a standing army and a police force and a network of informants that kept the empire's many restless peoples in something resembling order. An old joke from the Metternich era still held true. The monarchy rested on a standing army of soldiers, a sitting army of bureaucrats, a kneeling army of priests, and a creeping army of spies. Behind this young emperor stood his mother, Erzherzogin Sophie. She was the real force. She'd married into the Habsburgs from Bavaria. She was Ludovica's sister, which made her Sisi's aunt, and she'd spent decades positioning herself at the centre of power. It was Sophie who'd engineered her son's accession to the throne, Sophie who'd helped push Metternich out, Sophie who'd watched the revolutionaries of '48 with cold fury and made sure when her son took power that the promises of a constitution were quietly set aside. At the Viennese court they called her the secret empress, and they weren't entirely joking. She was a woman of tremendous will, tremendous discipline, and an absolute conviction that the Habsburg dynasty survived through ceremony, through spectacle, through the visible performance of an authority so old and so elaborate that no one could possibly question it. Every ritual mattered, every bow, every title, every precise placement of bodies in a room, it all carried meaning, and the meaning was power. Sophie had been searching for a wife for her son. She'd considered a Hohenzollern, a Prussian princess, which would have meant a Protestant bride, an enormous concession for the devoutly Catholic Habsburgs. Franz Josef had even travelled to Berlin, where he'd promptly fallen for a princess named Anna, who was already engaged to someone else. When that fell through, Sophie turned to her own family. The plan was simple and had the neatness of old-fashioned dynastic logic. Bring her sister Ludovica and Ludovica's eldest daughter Helene to the imperial summer retreat at Bad Ischl. Let Franz Josef meet the girl and settle the engagement before anyone had time to complicate things. Helene was the obvious choice. She was beautiful, well-educated, serious-minded, devout, everything a future empress ought to be. It was practically arranged before the carriage even left Munich. And then they arrived at Ischl, Ludovica, Helene, and, almost as an afterthought, the younger daughter, Sisi. 15 years old, not quite grown into her height, a little awkward in her formal dress, visibly uncomfortable in the candlelit rooms full of people she didn't know. She wasn't supposed to be the one anyone looked at. But Franz Josef looked at her. He looked at her, and something happened that no amount of political calculation had accounted for. The young emperor, who could have had any princess in Europe, who was surrounded every day by the most elegant women the Viennese aristocracy could produce, fell in love with a girl who still had lake water in her hair. He told his mother that evening, plainly and without apology. Not Helene, Elisabeth. She's the one. Sophie was startled. Ludovica was stunned. Helene, who had prepared for this her entire life, who had studied and practiced and dressed carefully for exactly this meeting, stood aside in silence while her younger sister, the one with no pretty features, the one who couldn't manage a proper curtsy, was chosen. It must have been an extraordinary moment in that room. All the planning, all the careful positioning, undone by a single glance across a table. There's something about this that feels almost unbearably human. The way love, or attraction, or whatever we want to call it, doesn't follow the script. Sophie had spent years building this match like an architect building a bridge. Every stone calculated, every load accounted for. And then her son walked in and kicked the whole thing sideways because a 15-year-old girl with melancholy eyes had caught his attention. You can almost feel the plans crumpling in Sophie's hands. Sisi didn't say no. She couldn't have. The Emperor's proposal wasn't really a question, and everyone around her, her mother most of all, understood that this was the kind of fortune you didn't refuse. Not if you were a second daughter from a minor branch of a royal house. Not if you had, as Ludovica had so recently written, not a single pretty feature to your name. You said yes. You said thank you. You began to learn very quickly the things you should have learned years ago. A little Austrian history, a little French, the proper way to curtsy, the correct forms of address for the dozens of archdukes and archduchesses you would soon be expected to recognise on sight. You scrubbed your teeth more carefully than before. You practised dancing. You tried on dresses that were heavier and more elaborate than anything you'd ever worn. And you also sat sometimes on the shore of the Starnberger Sea in the fading light of that last Bavarian summer, and you understood, without anyone having to say it, that you would not sit here like this again. Not like this. Not with your shoes off and your hair undone and the water lapping at the stones and nobody watching, nobody waiting, nobody standing behind you with a list of things you hadn't learned yet. She wrote about it later, years afterward, when the love had gone quiet and the palace had done its slow work on her. She called it destroyed. She wrote about a paradise that had been taken apart, an Eden that couldn't be rebuilt. She asked whether it was possible to forget that she'd once given her whole soul away, and received in return a crown she'd never wanted. But that was later. All of that was later. In August of 1853, in the mountains at Bad Ischl, a girl from a lakeside house in Bavaria became the future Empress of Austria. She was 15 years old. She loved horses and cold water and the smell of hay before the sun got high. She had bare feet more often than shoes, and a round face, and not a single pretty feature to speak of. And the most elaborate court in Europe was already preparing for her arrival. The morning she left Munich, she said goodbye to every person in the house. Not just the family, every person, the cook, the stable hands, the maids who'd folded her linens and swept her floors. She'd brought a gift for each of them, something small and chosen with care, and she reached out and took each of their hands in hers. Not a formal gesture, not a wave from across the room. She held their hands. She looked at them. Some of them were crying, and she was crying too, standing there in the entrance hall of the ducal palace, with her travelling clothes on, and the morning light coming through the tall windows, shaking hands with people she'd known since childhood, as though they were friends, because to her they were. It was the last time she'd be allowed to do that. As Empress of Austria, you didn't shake hands with servants. You didn't shake hands with anyone, really. You extended your hand, gloved and still, and certain people, carefully selected, properly ranked, were permitted to kiss it. That was the system. Sisi didn't know it yet, not in the way she'd come to know it, but something in the weight of those goodbyes must have told her that something fundamental was changing. The King of Bavaria was standing in her hallway, wearing the uniform of an Austrian regiment. The ex-King Ludwig was there too, the one who'd abdicated over Lola Montez. Everyone was in costume, everyone was performing, and the only thing that felt real was the hand of the kitchen maid closing around hers. Outside, the Ludwigstrasse was packed. Thousands of Münchners had come to see her off, standing in the spring air, pressed up against the walls of the buildings, climbing the railings for a better look. And when the carriage finally pulled away and she stood up in it, tears running down her face, waving a white handkerchief to the crowd, the sound that came back was enormous. A roar of love and farewell from a city that had watched her grow up and understood, perhaps better than she did, that she wasn't coming back. Not as this girl, not as Sisi from Possenhofen. Whatever came back, if anything came back at all, would be wearing a crown and a title and a name that wasn't quite her own anymore. The journey took 3 full days. The first stretch was by carriage, Munich to Straubing, rattling over roads that hadn't improved much in a century. At Straubing she boarded a steamship and the protocol began. The ship was called the Franz Joseph. It was the most magnificent vessel that had ever sailed the Danube. A great paddle steamer powered by engines built in London, 140 horsepower, which the newspapers described at length because the technology was still new enough to be thrilling. But the engines weren't what you noticed. What you noticed was the decoration. The bridal cabin was lined in purple velvet. The deck had been transformed into a living garden, banks of flowers arranged along the railings, and in the centre of it all a bower of roses. Real roses, hundreds of them, woven into an arbour where Sisi could sit and be sheltered from the wind and the staring. Rose garlands hung from the ship's sides all the way down to the waterline, trailing in the brown current of the Danube. Bavarian flags flew alongside Austrian ones, blue and white beside red, white, red, and the black and gold banner of the Habsburgs rippled above them all. No other ship was permitted on the river that day. The whole of the Danube, from Straubing to Vienna, belonged to this one vessel and its cargo of roses and nervous royalty. The water was high and fast in April. There were no locks yet, no dams, no power stations to slow the current, and the great paddle wheels churned through it with a steady rhythm you could feel through the deck, a low vibration that never quite stopped, like a heartbeat underneath the flowers. They moved downstream through the Austrian countryside, and at every town, every village, every bend in the river where a handful of houses stood, people had gathered on the banks to see her. School children in white dresses, farmers who'd left their fields, workers whose factories had closed for the day. Women holding infants up over the crowd so that someday they could say the child had been there when the Kaiserbraut sailed past. At every landing there were dignitaries, the mayor, the schoolteacher, the parish priest, standing in their best clothes beside wooden arches draped with bunting. There were brass bands playing the imperial hymn. There were cannon salutes that rolled across the water and echoed off the hills. There were speeches, always speeches, each one longer and more flowery than the last, praising the beauty and virtue of a girl that none of these people had ever seen before. Sisi stood on the deck and waved. She was pale, she was quiet, she was very, very tired. But she held up her lace handkerchief and she waved it at the people on the shore and she smiled, because that was what you did when 10,000 strangers were looking at you with hope in their faces. Her mother was still beside her. Her siblings were still there, making small jokes to settle her nerves, nudging each other and whispering. That helped. As long as they were near, the world still had familiar edges, but with every mile downstream, the familiar fell further behind. They passed the great Baroque abbey at Melk, rising white and gold above the river like something from a painting. They passed Dürnstein, where Richard the Lionheart had been held prisoner 700 years earlier, its ruined castle sitting on a crag above the vineyards. They moved through the Wachau, the wine country, where the terraced slopes came down almost to the water's edge, and the air smelled of stone and green leaves and the particular sweetness of old vines in early spring. The apricot trees along the banks were just beginning to blossom, pale pink against the grey rock, and the afternoon light came down at an angle that turned the river gold. It was beautiful country, under different circumstances, on a different kind of boat, with no brass bands, no officials, no speeches. It might have been the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. Stein, Krems, Tulln, Klosterneuburg. The names came and went like beads on a string, each one with its own little ceremony, its own brass band, its own cluster of officials wiping their foreheads in the April sun and practising their bows. I think about her standing on that deck for hours in her travelling clothes, with the river sliding past and the country changing around her. Bavarian hills giving way to Austrian ones, the landscape softening, the towns getting larger, the crowds getting denser. She was 16 years old. She'd never been to Vienna. She'd never been anywhere, really, except Possenhofen and Munich, and one unsuccessful trip to Dresden. And now the whole of Austria was turning out to watch her float past on a carpet of roses, and every face on every bank was looking at her with an expectation she couldn't possibly meet, because she didn't even know what was being expected. They wanted a saviour. That's not too strong a word. Austria in 1854 was a country in pain. The previous year's harvest had failed. There was hunger, real hunger, the kind that empties villages and fills the roads with people looking for work that doesn't exist. The political repression that followed the 1848 revolution was still grinding on. No parliament, no free press, political prisoners still rotting in the fortresses. And now there was war looming in the east, the Crimean crisis pulling the great powers toward a conflict that nobody could quite control. Into all of this came a young bride on a ship full of flowers, and the people on the banks looked at her and thought, maybe she'll soften him, maybe she'll speak for us, maybe things will get better now. They didn't know that she had no idea what a Crimean crisis was. They didn't know that she'd never read a newspaper with any attention, that she couldn't have found Galicia on a map, that she thought the word constitution was something that happened in other countries. She was kind, she was warm, she cared, instinctively and without pretension, about people who were suffering. But she was also a child, a sheltered, half-educated child, who'd spent the last few months learning how to dance properly and how to brush her teeth with more diligence, and who had been told almost nothing about the empire she was about to enter. As the ship approached Nussdorf, the last stop before Vienna, the mood on board shifted. Sisi went below to change. She came back up in one of her formal dresses, a rose-coloured silk with a wide crinoline, a white lace mantilla over her shoulders, a small white hat set carefully on her dark blonde hair. She looked fragile and lovely and not at all ready for what was about to happen. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the cannons of Vienna began to fire. Every church bell in the city rang at once. Not one at a time, not staggered, but all of them together. Hundreds of bells in dozens of steeples, and the sound that came rolling across the water was so vast and so physical that you could feel it in your ribs. The banks at Nussdorf were black with people. They stood shoulder to shoulder all the way back from the water's edge, and on the slopes above and up on the heights of the Leopoldsberg, thousands of tiny figures silhouetted against the sky, all of them watching one ship come around the last bend of the river. And then, before the ship had even properly docked, before the ropes were tied and the gangway lowered, a figure in a marshal's uniform leapt from the shore onto the deck. Franz Joseph. He'd ridden ahead from Vienna at dawn to be there first, outside the protocol, ahead of the schedule, just a young man in love jumping onto a boat to reach his bride. He took her in his arms and kissed her, right there, in front of tens of thousands of people, and the sound that came up from the crowd was like nothing she'd heard before. It was, by all accounts, an extraordinary moment. People who were there compared it to the great love story of Maria Theresa and her Franz, that legendary Habsburg marriage that everyone still talked about a century later. For a few seconds it was simple and real. A man and a woman, a kiss, a crowd cheering. Then Sophie stepped onto the ship, and the official part began. And then Sophie was there, and the protocol took over like a machine switching on. The handcuffs, Sisi bending to kiss her aunt's hand, formally, as a subject greets a superior. The introductions, the endless, careful, precisely ordered introductions. Brothers of the emperor, uncles, aunts, cousins. A blur of faces and titles and hands extended to be kissed. Then off the ship, onto the shore, into a golden triumphal hall that had been built just for this moment, lined with mirrors and flowers and draped in silk, with tiered seating for the dignitaries on one side and the foreign ambassadors on the other, and Cardinal Rauscher standing in the centre to deliver a formal address of welcome. Then into the carriages, the Emperor with Duke Max in the first, Sisi with Sophie in the second, Ludovica with Franz Karl in the third, and the long processional drive through the suburbs of Vienna to Schönbrunn. Sisi sat in the carriage beside her aunt, her future mother-in-law, a woman she barely knew and already feared, and watched the streets of an unfamiliar city slide past. Döbling, Währing, Hernals, across the Schmelz, down the long straight line of the Maria-Hilfer-Strasse. Every house was decorated with flowers and flags. Every window was full of faces. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders. Women leaned from balconies, throwing petals that spun in the air and landed on the carriage roof like soft rain. And she was visible to all of them through the glass of the imperial carriage, visible and exposed, every expression readable, every tear noticeable. A girl in pink silk sitting very straight and trying not to cry while the whole of Vienna watched. At Schönbrunn, Franz Josef opened the carriage door himself and led her inside. And here is where the scale of the thing began to reveal itself. Schönbrunn had over 1,400 rooms, 1,400. It was a Baroque palace on a scale that made Possenhofen look like a garden shed. A city within a city, built by Maria Theresa to rival Versailles. The ceilings were painted with gods and angels and billowing clouds of gilded stucco. The floors were polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the light from chandeliers that held 1,000 candles each. The corridors were so long, so uniform in their grandeur, that you could walk for 10 minutes and still not know where you were. Every door was flanked by footmen. Every room smelled of beeswax and cut flowers, and the faint cold scent of stone that never quite warms up no matter how many fires are lit. And in the grand salon waiting for her was the family. Sophie presented the archduchesses first. Then the emperor presented the male members of the House of Habsburg, his father Franz Karl, his 3 younger brothers, and 15 additional archdukes. 15. Sisi stood there and shook hands and curtsied and tried to remember names she'd never heard before, faces she'd never seen, titles that ran to 3 lines of text. Then came the introductions to the High Court officials, then the formal presentation of the wedding gifts. First, the Emperor's gift, a diamond crown with a matching diamond corsage, a magnificent old piece of goldsmithery set with emeralds, reworked at a cost of 100,000 gulden. The crown had been dropped a few days earlier and hastily repaired. People whispered about the bad omen, and then came the thing she wasn't prepared for at all. Her 2 Bavarian ladies, the women who'd travelled with her from Munich, the last familiar faces in a sea of strangers, were given their farewell gifts and dismissed. In their place stood a new household, assembled by Sophie and staffed entirely with people of Sophie's choosing. An Obersthofmeisterin named Gräfin Esterhazy, 56 years old, a close confidant of Sophie's, a woman whose idea of her role was something between a court official and a governess for a difficult child, a Hofmeister, 2 young Hofdamen, a secretary, a Kammerfrau, 2 Kammerdienerinnen, 2 Kammermädchen, a valet, a doorkeeper, 4 footmen in full livery, a housekeeper, a cleaning woman. All of them answerable to Sophie, none of them chosen by Sisi, none of them known to her. She was, from this moment forward, surrounded entirely by strangers whose first loyalty was not to her. You know what stays with me about this. It's not the diamonds or the cannons or the 1,400 rooms. It's not the 15 archdukes or the 100,000 gulden crown. It's the Bavarian ladies being sent away. That quiet administrative act. 2 women given a brooch and a thank you and shown the door, and suddenly the last thread connecting Sisi to her old life was cut. She was alone inside the machine now, surrounded by people, watched by thousands, attended by a dozen servants, and completely alone. That evening she stood on the great balcony of Schönbrunn and showed herself to the crowd, because that was what was expected. Then there was a gala dinner, all pomp and silver and too many courses, and she sat through it in her heavy dress and her diamond crown, and tried not to let anyone see how frightened she was. From 4 in the afternoon to late at night, 7, 8 hours, she had not had a single moment to herself. Not one moment without someone watching, someone judging, someone noting whether her curtsy was deep enough, whether her smile was warm enough, whether she held her fork correctly. She was 16. The day before yesterday she'd been standing in a hallway in Munich holding the kitchen maid's hand. Now every hand in the room was waiting to be kissed, and hers, the hand that had once reached out freely to anyone she chose, was the only one that wasn't allowed to reach out first. The Augustinerkirche, on the evening of the 24th of April, 1854, was lit by 15,000 candles, not electric lights. Those didn't exist yet, but candles, real ones, wax and wick and flame, 15,000 of them burning at once in a church draped floor to ceiling in red velvet, and the light they threw was alive. It moved, it breathed, it caught the diamonds on every woman's throat and sent small fires spinning across the walls, and the vaulted ceiling and the gold embroidery on the vestments of the 70 bishops and prelates who stood in rows behind the altar, waiting. The air was thick with beeswax and incense, and the scent of hundreds of perfumed bodies pressed into pews that hadn't been designed to hold this many people. A Swiss diplomat who was there wrote afterward that the display of jewellery alone was unlike anything he'd ever seen. A sea of diamonds, he called it, that seemed to multiply itself in the candlelight until the whole church shimmered. Into this walked a girl in silver and pink. Her dress was silk shot through with silver thread, and the train was long enough that it took 2 attendants to manage it behind her. On her head sat the diamond crown, the one that had been dropped and hastily repaired, the one that people were already calling a bad omen, and at her breast a diamond corsage so heavy that it pulled at the fabric of her bodice. She was pale, she was trembling. She was the most watched person in the Austrian Empire at that moment, and she was 17 years old, and the candlelight made her look even younger. Franz Joseph stood at the altar in his dress uniform, blond and composed, and very still. He'd been emperor for 6 years already. He knew how to stand in a room full of thousands and not flinch. That was something he'd been trained for since birth, the ability to be seen without reacting to being seen, to hold his body in a way that communicated authority and calm, even when the situation called for neither. Sisi had not been trained for this. She'd been trained for it hastily, in a few frantic months, and the training hadn't taken. She walked toward him through the candlelight and the diamonds and the staring faces, and everything about her, the trembling hands, the rigid spine, the eyes that looked nowhere and everywhere at once, said that she was terrified. The ceremony was long. Cardinal Rauscher, the Archbishop of Vienna, performed the marriage with the kind of oratorical enthusiasm that earned him, among the less reverent members of the Viennese public, the nickname Cardinal Plauscher, Cardinal Chatterbox. His address went on, a river of metaphor about roses and islands and storms and the sacred duty of Christian matrimony, about the emperor as hero and saviour and the bride as the gentle balm that would soothe his cares. He compared Franz Joseph to a warrior who had defeated the demons of revolution. He compared Elizabeth to a flower that would bloom on the summit of the throne. He did not, at any point, say anything that was of the slightest practical use to a frightened girl who was about to become the most isolated woman in Europe. At the moment of the ring exchange, a battalion of grenadiers on the Augustiner Bastei fired the first salvo, and then the cannons opened up, a rolling, crashing thunder of artillery that announced to the city and to the empire that Herzogin Elisabeth in Bayern was now Kaiserin von Österreich. The sound hit the church like a wave. The candles flickered, the diamonds shuddered on their chains, and inside the church, in the silence between the salvos, the 70 bishops bowed their heads. I think about what it must have sounded like to her. Not triumphant, not celebratory, just loud. Overwhelmingly, bewilderingly loud, coming from every direction at once, shaking the air inside a church that was already too warm and too bright and too full of people she didn't know. And she couldn't cover her ears. She couldn't step back. She couldn't close her eyes or look away or do any of the things a person does instinctively when the world becomes too much. She had to stand still and smile and be the thing they'd made her. A symbol, a figure, a surface for other people's hopes to land on. After the ceremony, the protocol machine engaged with a precision that would have been impressive if it hadn't been so relentless. The newly married couple returned to the Hofburg, and in the audience chamber the victorious generals of 1848 were the first to be received. Radetzky, Windischgrätz, Nugent, Jellachij, the men who'd crushed the revolution and held the empire together by force, then the foreign ambassadors. The Außenminister Buol presented each one to the new Kaiserin, and she stood there and accepted their congratulations, and tried to say the right things in the right order while her crown dug into her temples and her corsage pressed against her ribs. Then came the circle, and this is where things fell apart. The circle was one of the central rituals of the Habsburg court, a formal reception in which the Empress moved through a room full of the highest-ranking women in the empire, speaking to each one briefly, graciously, with the kind of effortless warmth that made the recipient feel seen and honoured. There was one absolute rule. Nobody could speak to the Empress first. She had to initiate every conversation. The ladies stood in their places, in their diamonds and their silks, and waited in silence until the Empress addressed them, and only then could they respond. Sisi knew the rule, but knowing it and being able to follow it were entirely different things. She walked into the ceremonial hall, a long high-ceilinged room lit by chandeliers that threw hard, bright light on everything below, and saw dozens of unfamiliar faces, women in full court dress, diamonds at their throats, feathers in their hair, expressions that hovered somewhere between curiosity and judgment. These were the palace damen and the apartment-eligible ladies of the highest Viennese aristocracy, women who'd been raised from birth to navigate these rooms, who knew every rule and every rank and every invisible line of precedence as naturally as they knew their own names. And they were watching her, silently, expectantly, waiting for her to speak first, because the rule said she must, and the rule was everything. And she froze. She couldn't think of what to say. She didn't know their names, didn't know their ranks, didn't know which of them was a Fürstin, and which was a Gräfin, and which was merely a Baronin, and why the distinction mattered so much and what you were supposed to say differently to each one. So she said nothing. She walked past them in silence, and they stood in silence, and the room filled with a quiet that was worse than any noise, a watching, waiting, evaluating silence that pressed in from every side. Gräfin Esterhazy, the Obersthofmeisterin, eventually rescued the situation. She stepped forward and asked the ladies, discreetly, to say a few words to the young Empress themselves, a clear violation of protocol, but a necessary one, because the alternative was an Empress walking through a room of mute aristocrats like a ghost passing through a gallery of statues. The ladies spoke. Sisi responded quietly, gratefully, her voice barely carrying. The circle limped to its conclusion, but then something happened that was worse than the silence. In the crowd of unfamiliar faces, Sisi spotted two she knew, her Bavarian cousins Adelgunde and Hildegard, who'd come to Vienna for the wedding. Instinctively, naturally, the way she would have greeted them at Possenhofen or at a family gathering in Munich, she stepped forward to embrace them. She opened her arms, she was going to hug them, the way cousins hug, the way family holds each other when they meet in a room full of strangers. The reaction around her was immediate. The faces of the courtiers stiffened. Gräfin Esterhazy drew a sharp breath, and Sophie, watching from across the room, intervened. No, not like that. The cousins were to perform the hand-kiss, the formal hand-kiss that every woman, regardless of family connection, owed to the Empress. Sisi protested. "We're cousins," she said. The words hung in the air for a moment, simple and true and completely beside the point. Sophie reminded her of her position. The rank of Kaiserin did not bend for blood ties. It did not bend for affection. It did not bend at all. The cousins kissed her hand, formally, and the moment passed, and the watching court filed it away as one more piece of evidence that the new Empress did not understand the rules. You know what gets me about this? It's such a small thing. An embrace that didn't happen. A pair of arms that opened and then closed again. Empty. But in that gesture, in the reaching out and the being stopped, you can see the whole shape of what her life was going to become. Every natural impulse checked. Every warm instinct redirected into ceremony. She'd wanted to hold her cousins, and she'd been told to let them kiss her hand instead. And the distance between those two acts, between holding and being kissed, was the distance between the life she'd had and the life she was entering. It was measured in inches, and it was infinite. The evening continued. There was a Hofball, the great court ball, the social pinnacle of the wedding festivities. Johann Strauss himself conducted, and the music floated through the ceremonial rooms of the Hofburg like something weightless and sweet, entirely at odds with the rigid formality of everything else. The Emperor and Empress sat beneath a canopy of red velvet and watched the dancing, and then they danced themselves. Not with each other, of course, because protocol required them to dance with partners selected by the court. Sisi was paired with men she'd never met, led through figures she'd only half learned, in a room where every eye was on her. Sophie noted in her diary, with a precision that bordered on cruelty, that Franz Joseph had to whisper the dance steps to his bride because she didn't know the figures well enough. The Viennese court danced differently from Munich. Everything was different from Munich. The way you held your partner, the way you entered the room, the way you sat down and the way you stood up and the angle at which you inclined your head when someone of a specific rank approached you. It was a language, and Sisi didn't speak it, and every misstep was noted. The ball ended late. Then the illumination of the city, every major building lit up, the streets full of people out to celebrate, carriages carrying the imperial couple through avenues of light while the crowds cheered. Then back to the Hofburg, exhausted, wrung out, still in the heavy dress and the diamonds, for the last ceremony of the day, the Bettelgessen, the scene of putting the bride to bed. In other European courts, this was an elaborate and mortifying ritual. The entire extended family following the bride to the bedchamber, watching the bride undress, watching her get into bed, watching the groom arrive, watching him get into bed beside her, and only then withdrawing with prayers and blessings. King Johann of Saxony, who'd married Sisi's Aunt Amelie, once described how he'd had to undress and climb into bed in front of all the married princes and princesses of the royal house, and then get up again after they left to put on his real nightclothes. That was the standard. For Sisi, it was slightly less terrible. The two mothers, Sophie and Ludovica, led her to her rooms. Sophie stayed in the small anteroom beside the bedchamber while Ludovica helped her daughter into bed. Then Sophie brought Franz Joseph in. She saw Sisi one last time before withdrawing, and what she wrote in her diary that night was this. The girl hid her face in the pillow, her hair falling around her, like a frightened bird burying itself in its nest. A frightened bird in its nest. Sophie wrote that down and went to bed, and whatever tenderness the image contained was not enough to make her change anything about how the next morning would go. Because the next morning, and this is the part Elizabeth would return to again and again for the rest of her life, Sophie came to the couple's breakfast. She didn't wait to be invited. She didn't knock and ask if it was convenient. She arrived, with Ludovica in tow, and sat down at their table in the small writing cabinet where the newlyweds were eating their first meal together as husband and wife. Sophie wrote in her diary that the emperor was radiant, a picture of sweet happiness, and that Sisi was moved when she embraced her mother. The two mothers made a show of offering to leave, and Franz Joseph, polite as always, asked them to stay. What else could he have done? They were his mother and his mother-in-law, and he'd been raised to defer to them in all things, and they were already sitting down. Then came the line that reveals everything. Sophie wrote, "Afterward, a private conversation of each child with their mother." Each child, that's what she called them. A 23-year-old emperor and his 17-year-old wife, on the morning after their wedding night. And the private conversation was exactly what it sounds like. Sophie took her son aside and asked him, in detail, how the night had gone. And the answer, which the entire court somehow knew by afternoon, was that the marriage had not yet been consummated. It would take 3 nights. And when it finally happened, everyone knew about that too, because on that particular morning Elizabeth refused to come to the family breakfast, and her refusal was itself the announcement. She told her Hofdammgraf in Festetics about it years later. The emperor was so accustomed to obeying, she said, that he gave in to his mother's insistence on the morning visit without protest. But for me it was horrible. For his sake, I went. She went. She sat at the breakfast table with her mother-in-law on the morning after she'd become a woman, and she endured the scrutiny, the knowing glances, the delicate questions that weren't quite questions, because her husband's obedience to his mother was stronger than his instinct to protect his wife's dignity. There's something here I can't let go of. It isn't the cruelty. Sophie wasn't being deliberately cruel. She was doing what had been done for generations, what she herself had endured, what every Habsburg bride before her had endured. The morning visit, the quiet interrogation, the confirmation, passed along through whispers and diary entries that the dynasty's future was being properly attended to. It was normal. That's what makes it so hard to sit with. It was entirely, completely, unquestionably normal. The system didn't require malice. It didn't need a villain. It just needed a set of habits that were old enough that nobody thought to examine them anymore, and a girl who was too young and too outnumbered to say no. The days that followed were more of the same. Deputations arrived from every corner of the empire, Lower Austria, Upper Austria, Styria, Carinthia, Carniola, the Bukowina. And Sisi stood between her husband and her mother-in-law and received them, one after another, hour after hour, changing clothes between each reception, because each delegation required a different level of formality and a different style of dress. For the Hungarian delegation, she wore Hungarian costume for the first time, a pink dress with a black velvet bodice and fine lace trimming, a gift from Sophie. Even Sophie admitted she looked beautiful in it. The Emperor wore his hussar uniform beside her, and for a moment they were a striking pair, young, elegant, glowing with the particular kind of beauty that comes from being exhausted and terrified and determined not to show it. But behind the beauty, the machinery kept turning. Every meal was an official event. Every appearance required preparation. Every room she entered had already been arranged according to a hierarchy she didn't understand, with people standing in positions determined by rank and protocol and centuries of accumulated precedent, all of them watching, all of them measuring her against a standard she hadn't known existed until she walked into it, and she'd only been in Vienna for 3 days. 3 days, and the cage was already built. The Augustinerkirche on the evening of April the 24th, 1854, was lit by 15,000 candles. Not electric light, not gas. 15,000 individual flames, each one set by hand, filling the nave with a warmth that was almost liquid, turning the red velvet drapes to the colour of dark wine, and catching the facets of every diamond in the room until the air itself seemed to glitter. 70 bishops and prelates stood in attendance. The pews were filled with the highest-ranking aristocracy of the empire, and the jewels they wore, the tiaras, the corsages, the ropes of pearls layered over silk bodices, threw so much reflected light that one witness wrote it was as though a sea of precious stones was flowing past his eyes. Sisi walked through it in silver and rose. Her gown was heavy, layers of silk interwoven with silver thread, a long train that 2 attendants managed behind her, the new diamond diadem pressing into her temples, the diamond corsage at her breast catching the light and throwing it back in small sharp sparks. She was 17. She'd been in Vienna for 2 days. She'd had almost no sleep, and the weight of the dress and the crown together was enough to make her shoulders ache before she'd taken 10 steps. And now she was walking down the centre of this enormous, blazing, diamond-scattered church toward Cardinal Rauscher, who was waiting at the altar with a speech so long and so florid that the Viennese would nickname him Cardinal Plaucher, Cardinal Chatterbox, before the week was out. Franz Joseph stood beside her in his marshal's uniform. He looked calm, the way he always looked. Composed, upright, a man who'd been trained since childhood to stand still in public and betray nothing. If he was nervous, you wouldn't have known it. If she was terrified, everyone knew it. Her face was white, her hands were trembling, and the cardinal was only just beginning. He spoke about the revolution of 1848, as though it were a plague that had been narrowly survived. He spoke about the young emperor as a hero and a saviour. He spoke about the bride as a rose, as a violet, as an island of peace in a stormy sea, as a beacon of light for the suffering peoples of the monarchy. He compared their union to a fortress of Christian virtue, and he said the word love in a way that made it sound like an administrative function. The speech went on, sentence after golden sentence, and the 15,000 candles burned lower, and the bishops shifted their weight from one foot to the other, and the Belgian ambassador wrote a note to Brussels observing, with dry amusement, that in a city where revolutionary barricades had stood not 5 years earlier, it was clearly useful to display the full majesty of the monarchy. Sisi stood there in her silver dress and tried to stay upright. The heat from 15,000 flames had turned the church into something close to a furnace, and the air smelled of melting wax and incense and the warm perfume of 1,000 bodies in their finest clothes. When the moment of the ring exchange finally came, a grenadier battalion stationed on the Augustener Bastille outside fired the first salvo. Cannon answered cannon across the city, a rolling thunder that shook the windows of the church and announced to every person in Vienna that the Herzogin Elisabeth in Bayern was now the Kaiserin von Österreich. The sound was deafening, even through stone walls. And then it was done, and they were married, and the real work of the evening began. Because the ceremony was only the beginning. After the church came the audiences. The victorious generals of 1848 were first, Radetzky, Windischgrätz, Nugent, Jeličić, old men with medals and hard faces, the men who'd crushed the revolution and kept the Habsburgs on their throne. They filed past the young couple in the audience chamber, bowing, receiving a word or a nod, each one precisely ranked, each one accorded exactly the degree of attention his station demanded. Then the ambassadors, then the ambassadors' wives, then the gratulation schour, the formal congratulatory reception in the great ceremony hall, where the Palace Daemon and the cavalier of the court waited to be presented, and one by one were admitted to the handkuss. And here is where it fell apart. Sisi had said something to one of her attendants around this time, a remark so simple and so devastating that it circulated through the court like smoke. "I love him so much," she said. "If only he were a tailor. If only he were a tailor. Not an emperor. Not the ruler of 40 million people. Just a man with a trade and a small house and no court, no protocol, no 70 bishops, no 15,000 candles. Just a man she could love in private, the way ordinary people love each other, without the whole world watching." The rule was simple, and it was absolute. No one was permitted to speak to the Kaiserin unless the Kaiserin spoke first. This was not a suggestion. It was protocol, centuries old, designed to protect the majesty of the crown by ensuring that the sovereign always controlled the conversation. In practice, it meant that when the young empress entered a room full of people, dozens of them, all in full court dress, all watching her with the kind of scrutiny that could strip paint from a wall, she was expected to walk among them and initiate conversation. A question here, a pleasant remark there, a comment on a dress, a family connection, a recent event. It was supposed to look effortless, as though she was simply a gracious hostess putting her guests at ease. Sisi couldn't do it. She looked at the sea of unfamiliar faces, the powdered hair, the jewelled throats, the expressions that range from sceptical to openly critical, and she froze. She was too shy, too overwhelmed, too completely out of her depth to open her mouth and say something to a woman she'd never met. And because she couldn't speak, no one else was allowed to speak either. So the room fell silent. The most important social event of the year, the wedding reception of the Emperor of Austria, and the only sound was the rustle of silk and the faint creak of corsets and the soft, terrible ticking of everyone's patience running out. The silence stretched. The ladies in their diamonds looked at each other. The whispers started. Not out loud, not yet. But you could see them forming behind the eyes, the little calculations, the first careful assessments of this new empress who couldn't even manage a circle. It was Gräfin Esterhazy who finally rescued the situation, stepping forward and quietly asking the ladies to address a few words to the young Kaiserin themselves. It was a breach of protocol, a small one, done with the practiced smoothness of a woman who'd spent 30 years navigating the court. But it was also a signal, and everyone in the room understood it. This girl doesn't know what she's doing. Then came something worse. In the crowd of strangers, Sisi spotted two faces she recognised. Her cousins Adelgunda and Hildegard, Bavarian princesses she'd grown up with, girls she'd played with at Possenhofen. And instead of extending her hand for the required handkuss, she moved toward them with her arms open. She wanted to hug them. It was the most natural thing in the world. You see someone you love, you reach for them. But the room recoiled. The faces around her tightened. And before she could close the embrace, she saw the horror in their eyes and stopped. "We're cousins," she said, as if that explained it. As if that should be enough. Sophie didn't think it was enough. Sophie took her aside, not later, not privately, but right there in the middle of the reception, and told her that she was the Kaiserin now, and the Kaiserin did not embrace people. The Kaiserin extended her hand. The Kaiserin maintained the distance that her rank required. It didn't matter that they were family. It didn't matter that she'd known them her whole life. The rules were the rules, and they applied to everyone, especially to her. I think about Sisi in that moment, arms half raised, caught between the impulse to hold someone she loved and the sudden understanding that holding people wasn't allowed anymore. There's something about it that goes beyond etiquette. It's the moment when the cage becomes visible. Not the golden bars of the palace, not the heavy doors of the Hofburg, but something smaller and more intimate. The discovery that even your own body doesn't move the way it used to, that the distance between you and another person is no longer yours to close. The evening ground on. There was the illumination of the city, Kohlmarkt, Michaelerplatz, the Graben, every building draped in light, the open carriage carrying the young couple through streets that looked like ballrooms. There was another meal, the wedding dinner, formal and interminable, silver and crystal and too many courses. And through all of it, Sisi held herself together, barely, her face a mask that didn't quite fit. It was nearly midnight by the time the ceremonies ended, and the two mothers led her to the bridal chamber. Sophie and Ludovica, the aunt who'd become her ruler, and the mother who was about to leave her behind. They walked her to her rooms in the Amalienhof, these two women who between them had arranged her entire life, and they helped her into bed. It was, by the standards of European courts, a mercifully simple Betelgeuse. At the Saxon court, when Sisi's own Aunt Amalie had married King Johann, the entire body of married princesses and their Obersthofmeisterinnen had accompanied the bride to her room, watched her undress, knelt for a prayer, and only then withdrawn, after which the groom had to enter the bedroom in the presence of all the married princes, climb into bed beside his bride while they watched, and wait for them to leave before getting up again to change into his nightclothes. By comparison, what Sophie arranged was almost intimate. Almost. She stayed in the small room next to the bedroom, waiting. Then she went to fetch her son, and she led him to his bride, and she looked in one last time to wish her good night. Sisi buried her face in the pillow. Sophie wrote about it later, with a tenderness that almost makes you forget who was in control of the situation. She looked like a frightened bird, Sophie said, hiding in its nest. It's a gentle image, and it's probably accurate. But there's something unsettling about the gentleness, because the person describing the frightened bird is the same person who built the nest and chose the room, and decided when the door would open and who would walk through it. What happened between the young couple in the nights that followed was naturally the business of the entire court. It was understood from the expressions at breakfast, from the whispered conferences between mothers and children, from the faint signals that travelled through the household staff like electricity through wire, that the marriage was not consummated on the first night nor on the second. The court knew this. Everyone knew this. And on the third morning, when it was finally done, the knowledge travelled outward from the imperial bedchamber with the speed and inevitability of light. That morning, Sisi refused to come to breakfast. She didn't want to leave the room. She didn't want to face Sophie, or Ludovica, or the assembled relatives, or the servants who would look at her and know. She wanted to be alone. Alone in the way she'd been alone at Possenhofen, truly alone, with no one watching, no one reading her face for clues, no one waiting to see how she held herself when she walked through the door. But Franz Joseph didn't understand. He was so accustomed to obeying his mother's wishes, so thoroughly trained in the machinery of the household, that refusing breakfast with the family simply didn't occur to him as a possibility. He went upstairs to his parents' apartment alone and waited for his wife to get up. She told her lady-in-waiting about it years later, and even then the humiliation was raw. The emperor was so used to doing as he was told, she said, that he gave in. But it was horrible for me. For his sake, I went. So she went. She climbed the stairs to Sophie's rooms with her husband, and she sat at that table, and she let Sophie look at her, and she ate breakfast under the gaze of a woman who had already, that morning, interrogated her own son about the private details of his wedding night. Sophie's diary records it with a phrase that reads like a door closing. Confidential conversation of each child with its mother. Each child. As though the emperor and his bride were still her children, still under her authority, still required to report. There's something about this morning that Elizabeth never got over. She came back to it again and again in later years. This specific morning, this specific humiliation, the walk up the stairs, the eyes of the household on her, the breakfast table where nothing was private and nothing was safe. It wasn't violence. It wasn't cruelty in any way the court would have recognised. It was just the system doing what the system did, absorbing another person into its workings, fitting her into the schedule, making sure that even the most intimate corners of her life were visible to the people who ran the machine. The days that followed were more of the same. Deputations arrived from the provinces, Niederösterreich, Oberösterreich, Steiermark, Kärnten, Krain, the Bukowina, and Sisi stood between her husband and her mother-in-law and received them, one after another, hour after hour, each delegation requiring its own ceremony, its own formal greeting, its own precisely calibrated display of imperial graciousness. Even Sophie, who'd been doing this for decades, admitted she was exhausted. Between audiences there were meals, and before every meal there was a change of clothes, and every change of clothes took the better part of an hour. For the reception of the Hungarian delegation, Sisi wore Hungarian dress for the first time. A pink gown with a black velvet bodice and magnificent lace trimming, a gift from Sophie. Even Sophie had to admit that Sisi looked beautiful in it. She and the Emperor in his hussar uniform, Sophie wrote in her diary, were the most beautiful and gracious couple. It was one of the rare moments when admiration overcame control, when the mother-in-law allowed herself, briefly, to see not a project to be corrected, but simply a young woman who looked lovely in a dress. 3 days after the wedding came the great Hofball. Sisi appeared in white gown, new diamond belt at her waist, a diadem and a wreath of white roses in her hair, and sat with Franz Joseph under a baldachin of red velvet, while Johann Strauss and his orchestra played waltzes that would outlive everyone in the room. The couple danced, but not with each other. That wasn't how it worked. The protocol selected your partner, someone of appropriate rank, someone whose placement in the dance would send the right political signal. And Sophie noted in her diary, with the precision of a woman who missed nothing, that the Emperor had to whisper the steps to his wife because Sisi still didn't know the Viennese figures well enough to manage on her own. She was learning, in those first days, that even dancing wasn't free. The music was beautiful. Strauss at the height of his powers, the waltzes spinning through the candlelit hall like something alive. But she couldn't choose her partner, couldn't choose the dance, couldn't move through the room the way her body wanted to move. She moved the way the court required her to move. And when the evening was over and the last carriage had gone, and the candles were finally put out, she went back to her rooms in the Amalienhof, and someone helped her out of her white dress, and someone unpinned the roses from her hair, and someone took away the diamond belt and the diadem, and she was alone at last. Alone in a palace of 1,400 rooms, in a city of 500,000 strangers, married to a man she loved but barely knew, under the authority of a woman she feared and could not escape. She was 17 years old, and morning was already coming. Let's talk about hands. Because at the Viennese court in the middle of the 19th century, the way you used your hand said more about your position than anything you could possibly say with your mouth. There was an entire unwritten language of gesture. Who could touch whom, how, under what circumstances and in what direction the touch was permitted to flow. It was one of the first things Sisi had to learn, and it was one of the things she never stopped getting wrong. The basic rule was this: the Kaiserin's hand moved outward, toward other people, down the hierarchy. She extended it, gloved and still, and the person in front of her, if they were of sufficient rank, if they'd been approved, if the moment had been sanctioned by the Obersthofmeisterin, was permitted to take that hand, bow over it, and press their lips to the glove. That was the handkuss. It wasn't a kiss in any emotional sense. It was a transaction, precise and codified, performed thousands of times a year in the halls of the Hofburg. It said, "I acknowledge your rank, and you acknowledge mine." The hand that was kissed did not squeeze, did not grip, did not pull the other person closer. It rested there, passive, offered and withdrawn in a single controlled motion, like a sceptre being briefly displayed and then locked away again. Sisi's hands didn't work like that. Her hands reached. In Possenhofen she'd shaken hands with the stable boys and the village children and the old cook who'd been with the family since before she was born. She'd held her siblings' hands when they were climbing. She'd grabbed her father's arm on horseback. Her hands were instruments of warmth, of spontaneity, of the kind of physical connection that says, "I see you, you're real, we're in this together." At the Viennese court all of that was over. Her hands now belonged to the protocol, and the protocol said, "Extend, don't clasp. Offer, don't reach. And above all, never, never be the one who moves first towards someone who hasn't been invited." The woman charged with enforcing all of this was Gräfin Sophie Esterhazy, born a Fürstin Liechtenstein, 56 years old, Sophie's closest confidant at court, and now Elisabeth's Obersthofmeisterin. The title translates roughly as Chief Lady of the Household, but the reality was something between a head of staff, a social secretary, and a governess for a teenager who'd arrived at court without any of the skills the position required. Esterhazy decided who was admitted to the Kaiserin's presence. She decided the order in which people were introduced. She decided when conversations ended and when rooms were entered and exited. She stood behind Sisi at every public function, a silent authority in dark silk watching the young empress the way a teacher watches a student who hasn't done the reading. Sisi couldn't stand her. Not from the first day, not from the first hour. There was something about Esterhazy's manner, the stiffness, the constant supervision, the way she looked at Sisi as though calculating the distance between what this girl was and what she ought to be, that made Elizabeth's skin crawl. Esterhazy walked behind her like a shadow in dark taffeta. She corrected her in public, a whispered word about posture, a gloved hand steering her elbow toward the correct position, a small shake of the head when Sisi began to say the wrong thing to the wrong person. She filled their private hours together with a running commentary on the genealogies and intrigues of the high aristocracy, who was connected to whom, which family was in favour and which was in decline, who had quarrelled with the Oberstkämmerer and whose daughter had married beneath her station. It was, from Esterhazy's perspective, essential knowledge for an empress. From Sisi's perspective, it was an unbearable stream of gossip about people she'd never met and didn't care about. Other people noticed the tension. The Imperial Adjutant Reckbecker wrote that Esterhazy treated the young Kaiserin a bit too much like a governess, and that her main preoccupation seemed to be initiating her charge into the endless social intricacies of the Viennese aristocracy, a subject in which Sisi had absolutely no interest. But Esterhazy had Sophie's full backing, and Sophie's backing was the only thing that mattered at this court, so the governor stayed, and the students suffered, and the lessons in how to hold your hands continued. The circle was the formal social gathering at which all of this came to a point. It happened regularly. At balls, at receptions, at the formal audiences that marked holidays and state occasions. The format was always the same. The Kaiserin entered the room. The assembled company, arranged by rank, waited, and then the Kaiserin moved among them, stopping here and there to speak, to acknowledge, to bestow that small gift of imperial attention that was worth more in the currency of the court than any diamond. The problem, the impossible, suffocating problem, was the silence rule. Nobody could speak to the Kaiserin unless she spoke first. In a room of 50 people, all of them watching, all of them waiting, the only voice that was permitted to break the silence was hers. If she didn't speak, nobody spoke. If she froze, as she had on her wedding night, the room froze with her. There was no rescue, no graceful way out, no one who could step in and fill the gap, except the Obersthofmeisterin, and even that was a breach of form, an emergency measure that left everyone feeling slightly embarrassed. We already saw what happened at the wedding circle, but that wasn't an isolated disaster. It kept happening. Week after week, month after month, Sisi walked into rooms full of the Viennese aristocracy and couldn't bring herself to speak to them. It wasn't that she had nothing to say. It was that every face in the room was a stranger's face, and every stranger's face was measuring her, and the silence around her felt less like space to fill than like a trap she kept walking into. The rooms themselves didn't help. High-ceilinged, gilded, mirrored on every wall so that the crowd seemed to multiply endlessly in every direction, so that wherever she looked she saw herself reflected back, small and pale and trapped in a frame of gold. She'd open her mouth, and the words wouldn't come, or she'd manage a few halting sentences, and the stiffness of the response would make her retreat. The Viennese Comtessinnen were not kind. They'd grown up in this world. They'd been trained for it since childhood. The art of court conversation, the precise calibration of warmth and distance, the ability to say something that sounded personal while revealing absolutely nothing. They could navigate a circle the way a dancer navigates a waltz, by instinct, without thinking, and they watched this awkward Bavarian girl stumble through it with a mixture of pity and contempt. There's a particular cruelty in a system that makes the person at the top the most exposed. Everyone else in that room had a script. They knew their role. Stand here, bow when she passes, answer when spoken to, keep it brief, keep it light, don't say anything that could be misinterpreted. Their only job was to respond. But the Kaiserin's job was to initiate, and initiating means being vulnerable. It means going first, reaching out, offering something to a stranger who might reject it. For someone as shy and as raw as Sisi, this was torture. The protocol had been designed for empresses who'd been raised at court, women who'd spent their entire lives learning the art of measured social performance. It had not been designed for a girl who'd been swimming in a lake 3 months ago. And then there were the deeper rules, the ones that didn't have names but were enforced just as rigidly. Sophie made it clear, early and unmistakably, that Elisabeth was not to form personal friendships with her Hofdamen. These young women, the Gräfinnen Bellegarde and Lamberg, both pleasant enough, were there to serve, not to befriend. The Kaiserin could be cordial, she could be gracious, but she could not be close. Closeness was dangerous. Closeness meant loyalty that bypassed Sophie, confidences that didn't reach Sophie's ears, a private world inside the palace that Sophie couldn't see into. And Sophie saw into everything. The whole system of who was and wasn't admitted to the Kaiserin's world had a name. Hofferhig. Courtworthy. It meant that your family's lineage had been examined, your bloodline approved, your rank verified against the official roles of the aristocracy. If you were Hofegg, you could attend court functions, be presented to the imperial family, dance at the Hofball, receive an invitation to the circle. If you weren't, if there was a grandmother who'd married a banker, a great-uncle in trade, a single generation of insufficient nobility anywhere in your family tree, you didn't exist. You could live in Vienna your entire life, own half a district, employ 1,000 workers, and never once set foot in the rooms where Sisi sat in silence and waited for someone to speak to her. The filter was absolute, and it meant that the only people Elisabeth was ever permitted to meet were people who'd passed through it. Her entire social world was pre-screened, pre-approved, pre-sorted by birth. There was no room in it for surprise, for accident, for the kind of encounter that happens when you walk down a street and talk to whoever's there. You know what gets me about this. It's the comprehensiveness of it. It wasn't just the public gestures that were controlled. The circle, the handcuffs, the formal audiences. It was the private ones too, who she could talk to in the corridors between events, who she could sit with at a window in the afternoon when there was nothing on the schedule, who she could laugh with, if she ever laughed, which she did less and less. The system didn't just regulate her public performance, it regulated her capacity for human connection. It drew a circle around her, a circle of rank and protocol and ancient custom, and it said, "No one comes inside this circle unless we approve them, and we will not approve anyone who might make you feel at home." The audiences were perhaps the clearest expression of the whole apparatus. When a foreign ambassador was received at court, the choreography was meticulous. The ambassador entered the audience chamber, which had been arranged according to a plan that specified, down to the metre, where every person would stand. The Emperor and Empress stood on a raised position. The Oberstofmeister and the Oberstofmeisterin stood behind them, slightly to the side. The Hofdamen arranged themselves in a precise formation that reflected their individual rank within the household. The cavalier stood opposite. The ambassador advanced to a mark on the floor, not too close, not too far, the distance calibrated to convey respect without presuming intimacy. Bowed 3 times, each bow slightly deeper than the last, and delivered his remarks. The emperor responded. Then the Kaiserin was expected to say something, a pleasantry, a question about the ambassador's country or family, something gracious and forgettable. The whole thing took perhaps 20 minutes. The preparation took hours. Every position had to be confirmed. Every person had to know their mark. The Oberstofmeisterin rehearsed the sequence with the household staff. The correct forms of address were reviewed. Not just the ambassador's, but his wife's, because the wives were received separately, in a different room, with a different formation, and a different set of rules about who curtsied first and how deeply, and whether the Kaiserin extended one hand or both. It was, in its own way, magnificent. A piece of human choreography refined over centuries, every movement loaded with political meaning, every gesture a signal to the watching world about the power and permanence of the Habsburg dynasty. But for the girl inside it, the girl who was supposed to stand at the centre and perform, it was like being walled inside a clock. The gears turned around her, the hands moved, and she stood still, because that was what the mechanism required. What made it worse, what made all of it worse, was that she could see, very clearly, that the rules served a purpose. They weren't arbitrary, they weren't petty. The ceremony and the protocol and the elaborate choreography of the circle existed to project an image of unassailable authority at a time when that authority was under real threat. The revolutions of 1848 were 5 years in the past, but their shadow hadn't lifted. The empire held together through force and spectacle, and the spectacle required the empress to be impeccable, gracious, controlled, regal, a living symbol of stability in a world that was shaking. If she stumbled, if she froze, if she reached out to hug her cousin in the middle of a state reception, the cracks showed. And cracks, in an empire held together by ceremony, were dangerous. Sisi understood this. She was not stupid. Far from it. She had a sharp, restless intelligence that her education had done almost nothing to develop, and she could see the logic of the machine even as it was grinding her down. But understanding it didn't make it easier. Understanding why you aren't allowed to hug someone doesn't make the prohibition feel less like a wound. And she carried these small wounds quietly, adding them up, day by day in those first months and years in Vienna, until the total was something she couldn't bear. The meals were part of it too, though you might not think of eating as a ceremony. But at the Hofburg, eating was never just eating. Every meal above the level of a private breakfast was a formal occasion. The seating was predetermined. The service followed a rigid sequence. The Kaiserin entered the dining room after the other members of the family were already seated, and she left before them. But the timing of that entrance and exit was regulated, not spontaneous, and before every meal she had to change, not adjust her dress, not smooth her hair, change entirely. A different gown, a different set of jewels, a different pair of gloves. The Kammerfrau and the Kammermädchen would unlace her out of one outfit and lace her into another, and the whole process could take 45 minutes to an hour, depending on the formality of the occasion. On days with multiple events, a morning audience, a luncheon, an afternoon reception, an evening ball, she might change 3 or 4 times, each time standing still while other people's hands fastened buttons and pinned brooches and adjusted hems around her body, and each time emerging from her rooms as a slightly different version of the same imperial figure. There's a detail from this period that I keep coming back to. In Munich, when she'd left for Vienna, she'd said goodbye to the household staff by shaking each person's hand. Each person. The cook, the maids, the grooms, the gardeners. She'd reached out and taken their hands and held them, and looked them in the eye, and thanked them for being part of her life. It was the most natural thing she knew how to do. Meeting another person as a person, palm to palm, with no glove and no ceremony and no one counting the seconds. Now she lived in a world where the same hands that had held a stable boy's were wrapped in white kid leather and offered to duchesses for a ritual that had nothing to do with warmth and everything to do with rank. The distance between those two gestures, the handshake and the handkuss, was the distance between Possenhofen and the Hofburg. And it was the distance that would define the rest of her life. She never got used to it. Decades later, when she was middle-aged and her beauty was famous across Europe, and her unhappiness was an open secret that nobody at court was quite willing to name, she still couldn't manage a circle with anything like grace. She still froze. She still went silent. She still felt in every formal room she entered the particular shame of being watched by people she couldn't reach. The girl who'd once shaken hands with the cook was still in there, somewhere behind the gloves and the diamonds, still wanting to reach out, still being told that reaching out wasn't permitted. The hands stayed still, the silence held, and the court went on turning round her, day after day, season after season, like a wheel that doesn't know how to stop. The hair started dark blonde and turned over the years to a deep chestnut brown. It grew and kept growing until it reached past her waist, past her hips, past her knees, all the way down to her heels, a waterfall of silk that, when she let it loose, hung around her body like a cloak. She could wrap it around her arms, she could disappear inside it. When she stood in front of the mirror with her hair unpinned, she looked less like a person than like a creature from a fairy tale, something half human, half forest, with dark waves pooling on the floor around her bare feet. This hair was the centre of her day. Not the audiences, not the meals, not the emperor, not the empire. The hair. Everything else arranged itself around it, because the hair took 3 hours every morning, and 3 hours is a long time. Longer than most audiences, longer than most state dinners, longer than most of the political meetings that decided the fate of provinces and the movement of armies. By the time the hair was done, the morning was gone, and whatever had been scheduled for the early hours had either been postponed or cancelled, or attended by someone else. The hair came first. The empire came second. 3 hours, every single day. Think about that for a moment. 3 hours of sitting perfectly still while someone else's hands moved through your hair, separating it into sections, combing each section smooth, braiding it slowly into the elaborate crown of interlocking plaits that became Elisabeth's signature. The Steckbrief frisure, she called it, the wanted poster hairstyle, because once it was pinned in place you could recognise her from across a ballroom. The braids wound around her head like a coronet, thick and heavy and gleaming, and the effect was extraordinary, regal and old-fashioned and completely unlike anything the other women at court were wearing. Nobody could copy it. Plenty of them tried, but nobody had enough hair, or enough patience, or a hairdresser with the particular genius required to make it work. The hairdresser was everything. The hairdresser was, in a strange and real way, the most important person in Elisabeth's daily life. More important than the Obersthofmeisterin, more important than most of the archdukes, possibly more important, on a day-to-day basis, than the emperor himself. Because if the hairdresser was good, Elisabeth's mood was good, and if the hairdresser was bad or absent or having an off day, everything else collapsed. An empress with poorly done hair was an empress who wouldn't leave her rooms, wouldn't attend a reception, wouldn't appear at dinner. The entire machinery of the court could be brought to a standstill by a single badly placed braid. Sisi found her hairdresser at the theatre. She was sitting in the imperial box at the Berg Theatre one evening, watching a comedy, and her eye was caught not by the performance, but by the hair of the leading actress, Hélène Gabillon. It was exquisitely arranged, elaborate, detailed, with a precision that suggested real artistry behind it. Sisi wanted to know who'd done it, she asked, and the name that came back was Fanny Angerer. Fanny was young. She was the daughter of a barber on the Spittelberg, one of the poorer neighbourhoods in Vienna, and she'd recently been appointed a hairdresser at the court theatre. She had, by all accounts, a striking appearance, and a quick, lively wit that was entirely at odds with the hushed gravity of the imperial household. She was not the kind of person who normally entered the orbit of an empress, but Elisabeth wanted her, and what Elisabeth wanted in this one narrow domain, she got. The appointment caused a minor sensation. It was reported in the newspapers, which was unusual for a hairdresser, but then again, nothing about this was usual. The Morgen Post ran the announcement under daily news with a tone of delicate amusement. The long-debated question of whether a male or female hairdresser would enter the service of Her Majesty the Empress had at last been decided. Fräulein Angerer would give up her duties at the theatre in exchange for a salary of 2,000 gulden a year, with permission to take private clients on the side if her schedule allowed. 2,000 gulden. It was what a university professor earned. It was more than most of the minor officials in the Imperial Civil Service would see in 2 years. Sophie was furious about the newspaper coverage and wrote angry notes in her diary about the impertinence of the press. But Fanny was worth it. She understood something about Elisabeth that almost no one else at court did. The hair wasn't vanity. It wasn't a whim. It was the one part of her appearance over which Elisabeth had complete control. The one thing she could shape and perfect and take pride in without asking anyone's permission. The crown they'd given her was heavy and someone else's. The dresses they put on her were chosen by protocol. The jewels were state property, taken out and put away by servants who answered to Sophie, but the hair was hers, and Fanny made it magnificent. The morning ritual went like this. Elisabeth sat in her dressing room, a high-ceilinged chamber with tall windows and mirrors on 3 sides, the light coming in cool and pale in the early hours. She wore a long white dressing gown, a peignoir of lace and fine cotton that covered her from neck to floor, because the hairdressing was a process that involved a great deal of loose hair falling over everything, and the white gown caught it and made it visible. She used the time. She always used the time. It was 3 hours she couldn't move. 3 hours she was pinned to a chair, so she filled them. She read. She wrote letters. In later years she studied Hungarian during the hairdressing, murmuring verb conjugations while Fanny's fingers worked through the braids. Later still, she hired a Greek tutor, Christomanos, whose job was to sit beside her and read Homer aloud while the hair was being arranged, translating passages of the Odyssey while pins clicked into place above her ears. It was education conducted in a dressing room, scholarship threaded through the teeth of a comb. Fanny stood behind her, dressed in black with a white apron of fabric so fine it looked like it was made of spider silk. She began by taking down whatever remained of the previous day's arrangement, removing pins, unwinding braids, letting the whole mass of hair fall loose until it hung like a curtain around Elisabeth's shoulders and pooled in her lap. Then the combing began. The combing was the dangerous part. Elisabeth was obsessive about her hair, and obsessive people notice things. Every hair that came loose in the comb was a small catastrophe, a sign of aging, a whisper that the one thing she controlled was slipping away from her. Fanny understood this, and she had a trick. She kept a strip of adhesive tape hidden under her apron, and as she combed, she quietly pressed the loose hairs onto the tape, out of sight, so that when the combing was done she could hold up the comb to the Kaiserin and show her, "Look, not a single hair lost. The comb was clean. The deception was kind, and it was necessary, and it went on for years." But even Fanny couldn't hide everything. Sometimes the hair did fall, and Elisabeth would see it, and the mood would darken, and the morning would take on a weight that had nothing to do with affairs of state, and everything to do with a few strands of chestnut brown on a white lace peignoir. She told her Greek reader Christomanos about it years later with a frankness that was almost uncomfortable. After a few days of bad hairdressing, she said, "I'm completely broken down. She knows it, and she waits for my capitulation. I am the slave of my hair, the slave of her hair." It's an extraordinary thing to say, and she meant it. Fanny held a power over Elisabeth that no politician, no general, no diplomat in the empire could match. When Fanny was pleased, the hair was glorious, and Elisabeth would face the day with something approaching confidence. When Fanny was displeased, when she'd been slighted over some small matter of household politics, or when her demands for extra privileges hadn't been met, she'd call in sick. She'd send a substitute, some other woman from the household, a Kammerfrau perhaps, someone competent but not Fanny, and Elisabeth would endure a morning of inferior hairdressing and emerge from it diminished, off balance, unwilling to be seen. The Emperor himself remarked on it once, after Fanny arrived in Budapest on a stretcher, carried by the Rettungsgesellschaft from the train station to the Burg, apparently too ill to walk. "It's a misery," Franz Joseph wrote, "when you depend on the health, and sometimes the moods, of one person." And then came the crisis that nearly ended everything. Fanny fell in love. His name was Hugo Pfefferlich, a clerk at a bank, an ordinary man with no connection to the court, and Fanny wanted to marry him. But the rules were clear. A married woman could not hold a position in the imperial household. Marriage meant leaving. Leaving meant the end of the hair, the end of the 3-hour mornings, the end of everything that kept Elisabeth's daily life from falling apart. Sisi went to Franz Josef personally. She asked him, with a directness that she rarely used in matters of court business, to make an exception. Let Fanny marry and stay. Let the rules bend just this once. And he did. Fanny married her Hugo, and Hugo was absorbed into the household too, first as Elisabeth's private secretary, then as her travel marshal, then as a Regierungsrat, then a Hofrat, and finally a Ritter, ennobled, lifted from a bank clerk's desk to a title and a coat of arms, all because his wife knew how to braid hair. Over the years, something else happened, something that tells you just how much Fanny had absorbed of Elisabeth's bearing, her posture, the particular way she carried herself. Fanny became a decoy. In Smyrna, when Elisabeth wanted to explore the city on foot without being mobbed by admirers, she sent Fanny out on the gala boat instead. Fanny sat in the gilded vessel, back straight, chin lifted, accepting the salutes of the harbour officials and the cheers of the crowds, while Elisabeth slipped ashore on a small rowboat and walked the streets unrecognised. It worked perfectly. The local dignitaries bowed and scraped to the hairdresser in the Empress's clothes, and the Empress, in a plain dark dress, disappeared into the bazaar. Years later it happened again, at the railway station in Marseille. A crowd had gathered on the platform to see the Kaiserin depart. Fanny walked the length of the platform in her most dignified manner, drawing every eye, while Elisabeth boarded the train quietly from the other end. She found it delightful. "Don't disturb the good Fanny," she whispered to her lady-in-waiting. "Let her have her audience. There's something here that I can't quite let go of. The fact that the one time Elisabeth used her influence to change a rule, the one time she went to the Emperor and said, 'This matters to me, do this for me,' it was about a hairdresser. Not about politics, not about the constitution or the provinces or the millions of people who lived under her husband's rule. About a woman who combed her hair. And I don't think it's trivial, not really. I think it tells you something about what happens when a person is cut off from everything else that might have mattered to them. The friendships forbidden by Sophie, the political involvement she was never encouraged to develop, the mothering she was barely allowed to do, all of it stripped away year by year, until what was left was the hair and the body and the long private hours of grooming that nobody could take from her because nobody else could do them. Every 3 weeks came the Haarwäsche, the hair wash. It consumed an entire day. The hair was so long and so thick that washing it was less a grooming task than an engineering project. The solutions changed constantly. Elisabeth was always experimenting, always searching for the perfect recipe, always consulting with pharmacists and perfumers about new extracts and tinctures. But the base was usually raw egg and cognac, mixed into a warm paste and worked through the full length of the hair, section by section, from the roots at her scalp to the tips that grazed the floor. The smell of it filled the dressing room. Sharp spirit cut with something rich and fatty, the cognac biting through the sweetness of the egg. The washing itself took hours. Rinsing took longer. The hair had to be absolutely clean, every trace of residue removed because anything left behind would dull the sheen that was the whole point of the exercise. Then came the drying, which could not be rushed because heat would damage the hair, so it had to dry naturally, spread over her shoulders and down her back, and she'd sit in her rooms for the rest of the afternoon with the windows cracked, feeling the slow evaporation of the dampness from the heavy strands. The entire day was blocked off, and on wash days Elisabeth was, as her household put it, unansprechbar, not to be spoken to. The Empire could wait, the Circle could wait, the ambassadors could wait. The hair was being washed. The weight of it caused her physical pain. So much hair, braided so tightly and pinned so high on her head, pressed down on her skull until her temples throbbed and her neck ached. On bad days, she'd retreat to her private rooms and sit for hours with her hair unpinned, the loose ends tied to ribbons that hung from hooks set high on the walls, suspending the hair above her head so that the weight was lifted and air could reach her scalp. She'd sit there like that, hair floating above her in dark ribbons, her head tipped back, her eyes closed, and read or write letters, or simply breathe. It was, if you think about it, the closest she ever got to being weightless. The closest she got to being free of the thing she loved most and couldn't escape. Christomanos, who had the job of reading Greek to her during the morning hairdressing sessions, left a description of the ritual that reads like a scene from a myth. Behind the Kaiserin's chair stood the hairdresser in her black dress with the long train, the white apron tied at her waist, a figure of imposing dignity. With white hands she buried herself in the waves of hair, lifting them, running them through her fingers like water, winding them around her arms like streams she was trying to catch because they wouldn't stay still. Then, when the braiding was done and the last pin was set, she brought forward a silver tray. On the tray lay the fallen hairs, the casualties of the morning's work arranged on the silver as though on a funeral bier. The Kaiserin looked at them. The hairdresser looked at the Kaiserin. Their eyes met for a single second. Reproach from the mistress, guilt and contrition from the servant. And then the white dressing gown was lifted from her shoulders, and the Kaiserin rose, and the hairdresser sank into something between a curtsy and a collapse, whispering the formal closing words of the ritual. "I feel my hair," Elisabeth told Christomanos. "It's like a foreign body on my head." He answered with a courtier's grace, "Your Majesty wears her hair like a crown instead of a crown." And she looked at him and said, "Only that you can take off any other crown more easily than this one." She wrote a poem about it once, a strange little verse that sits somewhere between love letter and death wish. She wrote about wanting to die into her hair, to pour all the strength of her life, all the vitality of her blood into the braids, and then to slip quietly away, drained and peaceful, while the hair lived on. It's an unsettling image. It's also, if you sit with it for a moment, the image of a woman who'd found the one thing that was entirely hers, the one thing the court couldn't schedule or regulate or hand to someone else, and who loved it so fiercely that the love had become a kind of prison of its own. 3 hours every morning, a silver tray of fallen hairs, a hairdresser who was also a confidant, a tyrant, a collaborator, and a double. An empress who sat in a chair with her eyes closed and let the world recede behind a curtain of chestnut silk. The hair was her crown, and like every crown, it was heavier than it looked. The dresses didn't have buttons, not the formal ones, not the ones she wore for state occasions and court receptions and the evenings at the opera, when the whole of Vienna would tilt its opera glasses toward the imperial box to see what the Kaiserin was wearing. Those dresses were sewn shut, around her, while she stood inside them. Let that settle for a moment. Imagine standing in a room in the Hofburg, arms slightly raised, while a Kammerfrau kneels at your feet and another stands behind you, and between them they stitch the seams of your bodice closed with needle and thread, pulling the fabric tight against your ribs, drawing the waist in until the silk lies flat against the corset beneath, and there isn't a wrinkle, not a single pucker, not a breath of looseness anywhere between your throat and your hips. The stitches are small and precise, placed so close together that the seam becomes invisible, and when they're done, the dress fits your body the way skin fits a fruit. Perfectly, immovably, as though it grew there. This was how Elisabeth got dressed. Not every day, for private mornings, for walks in the park, for the hours she spent in her gymnastics room, she wore simpler clothes that could be fastened with hooks and laces, but for anything public, anything official, anything that would be seen by the court or the city or the press, she was sewn in. Her riding habits were sewn in too, even those. She rode almost every day, and she rode hard, at a gallop that terrified her attendants, and she did it in a riding habit that had been stitched shut around her body that morning. The seams pulled so tight across the bodice that the fabric didn't shift or bunch even at full speed. It meant she couldn't dismount by herself. It meant she couldn't adjust her own clothing if something slipped or tore. It meant that if she fell, and she did fall more than once because she rode with the reckless abandon of someone who didn't care much about the consequences, she'd be lying on the ground in a dress she couldn't get out of without scissors and another pair of hands. And when the event was over, and the carriage had brought her back and the doors of her apartment had closed behind her, the stitches were cut with small sharp scissors, the dress was peeled away, and the whole process would begin again for whatever came next. On a day with multiple events, a morning audience, a luncheon, an afternoon reception, an evening ball, she might be sewn into and cut out of 3 or 4 different gowns. Each change took the better part of an hour, sometimes longer, because before the new dress could go on, the corset had to be adjusted, and adjusting the corset was a project in its own right. The corset was the foundation. Everything else, the dress, the silhouette, the way she moved through a room, depended on what the corset did to her body underneath. And what the corset did was brutal, even by the standards of an era that treated corsets as a basic fact of womanhood. Elisabeth's waist, when fully laced, measured 50 centimetres, just under 20 inches. She was 172 centimetres tall, 5 feet 8, taller than most women of her time, taller than many of the men at court, and she weighed, at her lightest, about 50 kilograms, 110 pounds. These numbers were famous. They circulated through the courts of Europe the way stock prices circulate through trading floors, with the same mixture of admiration and anxiety, because everyone understood that maintaining them required a discipline that bordered on something else entirely. Elisabeth weighed herself obsessively, multiple times a day, on a set of scales she kept in her dressing room, recording the numbers, tracking the fluctuations with the precision of an accountant. A single kilogram gained was a crisis. A morning where the scale showed 51 instead of 50 would cast a shadow over the entire day, sending her into a round of compensatory fasting that could last until the number returned to where she needed it to be. The lacing took an hour, sometimes more. The Kammerfrau worked from the bottom up, pulling each pair of laces through the eyelets, drawing the 2 halves of the corset together millimetre by millimetre until the waist was at the required measurement. Elisabeth stood very still during this. She held onto the back of a chair or the edge of a table, and she breathed in the shallow, careful way you learn to breathe when the air in your lungs is being slowly compressed. The stays were made of whalebone, long flexible strips cut from the Blean plates of Arctic whales, shipped from the ports of Norway and Scotland to the corset makers of Vienna, shaped and polished and inserted into channels sewn into the corset fabric. They bent with the body to a point. Past that point, the body bent to them. The front of the corset was stiffened with a busk, a flat piece of steel or bone that ran from the sternum to below the navel, holding the torso rigid, preventing any forward curve. You couldn't slouch in a corset. You couldn't bend at the waist. You couldn't take a full deep breath and let it fill the bottom of your lungs the way your body wants to when it's tired. You breathed from the top of your chest in small, careful sips of air, and you held yourself as straight as the busk held you, because you didn't have a choice. I think about the women who did this for her. The Kammerfrau and the Kammermädchen standing behind the Kaiserin in the dim morning light, pulling laces through eyelets, their fingers cramped, their own corsets pressing into their own ribs as they worked. They did this every day. They felt the resistance of the fabric, the slow compression of another woman's torso under their hands. They heard the change in her breathing. They knew, from the tension in the laces, exactly how tight was tight enough and when to stop. It was skilled work, intimate work, the kind of knowledge that lives in the hands and can't be written down, and nobody ever asked them how it felt to do it. Underneath the corset, Elisabeth wore something unusual. Not the layers of linen and cotton that most women of her class wore against their skin. The chemise, the petticoats, the drawers, the stockings held up with garters. She wore chamois leather, willed leader, soft, supple deerskin, cut and fitted to her body like a second skin, covering her from waist to knee. It was lighter than cotton. It was smoother than linen. It allowed her to skip the petticoats entirely, which meant the silhouette of the dress above could be narrower, cleaner, more dramatically tapered at the waist. The leather was oiled and worked until it was almost as soft as velvet, and it clung to her body with a closeness that would have been considered scandalous if anyone outside the dressing room had known about it. But nobody did. That was the thing about the Viennese court. The exterior was all silk and diamonds, immaculate and correct, and what went on underneath was private in the most literal sense, hidden between layers of fabric, known only to the hands that did the dressing. The dresses themselves were extraordinary. For formal occasions she wore gowns that could weigh 15 or 20 pounds, heavy silks embroidered with gold or silver thread, overlaid with lace, finished with trimmings of velvet or fur, the whole structure supported by a cage crinoline that held the skirt out from her body in a wide bell shape. The bodice was boned and lined and cut so close to the torso that it functioned almost as a second corset, reinforcing the compression underneath. The neckline showed her shoulders and the upper slope of her chest, and across that exposed skin lay the jewels, the diamond corsage, the emerald parure, the ropes of pearls that the Hofburg's vaults produced for each occasion, and took back again afterward, because they belonged to the crown, not to her. There's a story about the diamond corsage that I can't get out of my head. It was one of the great pieces of the Habsburg collection, a massive ornament of diamonds set in gold, designed to be pinned to the front of the bodice, covering the chest from collarbone to waist. It was worth a fortune, and it was heavy, and it was above all wide. One evening, as Elisabeth was leaving a state event and climbing into the imperial carriage, the corsage caught on the edge of the carriage door. She was stuck, half in, half out, the diamonds wedged against the doorframe, the footman frozen in embarrassment, the crowd on the street trying to pretend they hadn't noticed. It took several minutes to free her. The door had to be widened, or the corsage had to be unpinned, or both. The accounts differ on the details. What they agree on is the image, the most beautiful woman in Europe trapped in a doorway by the weight of her own jewels, unable to move forward or back. It's almost too perfect as a metaphor. But it happened, and it happened because the things they put on her body, the corset, the dress, the diamonds, were not designed for a person who needed to move. They were designed for a person who needed to be seen, standing still, in the centre of a room, framed by candlelight and protocol. Movement was an afterthought, if it was thought of at all. At night, when the last event was over and the stitches had been cut and the dress peeled away and the corset unlaced and the deerskin removed and the diamonds locked back in the vault, the maintenance continued. Elisabeth wrapped wet cloths around her waist before she went to bed. The cloths were soaked in a solution, sometimes vinegar, sometimes a herbal preparation from the court pharmacy, sometimes plain, cold water drawn from the deep wells beneath the palace, and bound tightly around her midsection, layer over layer, where they dry slowly through the long hours of the night, shrinking as they dried, pressing against her skin, keeping the waist at its required measurement even while she slept. The sensation must have been considerable. The initial shock of cold, the gradual tightening, the way the damp fabric stiffened and contracted as the hours passed. She lay in her bed in the Hofburg, in a room hung with silk damask and heated by a porcelain stove painted with pastoral scenes, wrapped in damp linen like a figure being prepared for preservation, and she slept, or tried to sleep, while the wet fabric tightened around her body and the porcelain stove ticked quietly in the corner, and the palace settled into its own vast silence around her. And then the face. The face had its own regime, separate from the hair, separate from the dress, occupying the hours between the evening undressing and the morning that followed. On certain nights, Elisabeth applied a mask of raw veal to her face, thin slices of calf meat, fresh, cold, carefully trimmed, pressed against her cheeks, her forehead, her chin, and held in place by a cloth tied around her head. She slept in it. She woke in it. The theory, as far as the court physicians could explain it, was that the proteins in the raw meat would nourish the skin, tighten the pores, slow the accumulation of the tiny lines that time draws across every face. Whether it worked is impossible to say. What it must have felt like. The cold, damp weight of raw flesh against your skin through the long hours of the night, the smell of it, the faint metallic tang of blood, is something you can imagine without much effort and wish you hadn't. There were other masks too. Strawberries, mashed and spread in a thin layer. Cucumber pulp, lanolin. Each one prescribed by a different authority. A court pharmacist, a visiting specialist, a recipe passed down through the victuals bags or picked up during one of Elizabeth's increasingly frequent travels. And there were the baths. She bathed in warm olive oil, a practice she'd adopted from Mediterranean tradition during her travels in Greece and Corfu, immersing herself in a copper tub filled with heated oil that was supposed to keep the skin supple and luminous and slow the drying that age brings. The oil was carried up from the kitchens in large vessels and poured into the tub by the Kammermädchen, who tested the temperature with their elbows the way a mother tests bathwater for an infant. Once the oil was heated too hot. Elizabeth climbed in and was badly scalded. Not enough to leave permanent scars, but enough to cause real pain. Enough to keep her out of the oil for days, and enough to make the household staff terrified of the olive oil bath from that point forward. They approached it like an operation after that, checking and rechecking the temperature, whispering anxiously among themselves, but they kept heating it, and she kept climbing in. The regime didn't stop for pain. There's something about all of this. The veal mask, the wet wrappings, the olive oil, the hour-long corset lacing, the stitching and unstitching of dresses, that goes beyond beauty. It goes beyond vanity too, though the court gossips certainly called it that. What it looks like from this distance is a woman trying to maintain control over the only territory she had left. Her body was the one thing that was undeniably hers. Not the crown, not the title, not the children Sophie had taken, not the political role she had never been given. Just the body, the waist, the skin, the face that the Winterhalter portrait had frozen at its most beautiful, and that she was now desperately, methodically, ritualistically trying to keep from changing. After she turned 30, she refused to sit for portraits. She avoided photographers with an almost physical revulsion, turning away, raising a hand, hiding behind whatever was available. A fan, a parasol, a book held in front of her face at just the right angle. When she walked in public, she carried a leather fan specifically for this purpose, and she used it the way a soldier uses a shield, positioning it between her face and anyone who might be looking. Her ladies-in-waiting learned to watch for cameras the way bodyguards watch for threats, and they would close ranks around her the moment a photographer was spotted, forming a wall of dark silk and parasols. The Winterhalter painting, the famous one, from 1865 with the diamond stars scattered through her loosened hair and the white gown slipping off one shoulder, became, in a sense, the last authorized image of her face. Everything after that was unauthorized, stolen, caught by a photographer who happened to be quick enough or positioned at precisely the right angle. She didn't want to be seen aging. She didn't want the world to watch her lose the one thing it had ever valued her for, and so she wrapped herself tighter, laced harder, applied the masks and the oils and the wet cloths with increasing discipline, increasing desperation, as though the body could be maintained by sheer force of will, as though 50 centimetres could hold forever if you just pulled the laces tight enough and wrapped the cloth wet enough and stood still enough for the needle. The morning routine grew longer. The dressing took more time. The requirements became more exacting. This seam must be invisible. This bodice must show no wrinkle. This waist must be exactly what it was last year, and the year before that, and the year before that. She wasn't trying to be beautiful. She'd stopped caring about beauty, if she'd ever cared in the way the court assumed. She was trying to hold something together, herself maybe. She was trying to keep herself from disappearing inside the machine that had swallowed her at 17, and the only tools she had were a corset and a needle and a strip of wet linen and the absolute exhausting, unrelenting discipline of a woman who had nothing else left to control. 50 centimetres, 110 pounds, sewn into silk every morning and cut free every night, only to be wrapped in wet linen until the morning came again. The dress was her armour, and like all armour, it was built for someone who expected to be under siege. In every palace Elizabeth lived in, the Hofburg in Vienna, the castle in Budapest, the Achillean in Corfu, the villas she rented along the Mediterranean coast, one of the first things she did was have gymnastics equipment installed. Not in a public hall, not in a courtyard where officers might exercise, not in any space the court would consider appropriate for such things. In her private rooms, behind locked doors, rings suspended from the ceiling on iron chains, a set of parallel bars bolted to the floor, a horizontal bar set at a height that allowed her to hang from it with her feet off the ground. The equipment arrived discreetly, was installed by workmen who'd been sworn to silence, and was used by one person only. The Empress of Austria, in a silk dressing gown, alone except for the occasional stunned observer who'd been admitted to the inner rooms and didn't know what they were about to see. Christomanos, the young Greek reader who spent so many hours beside her chair during the hairdressing ritual, was one of those observers. He left a description that reads like something out of a fever dream. She stepped up to the rings, he wrote, in her long gown, the train trailing behind her on the parquet floor, and she gripped the iron rings and lifted herself off the ground, with a smoothness that seemed to defy everything he understood about how empresses were supposed to move. She swung. She held herself in suspension, her body straight, her arms locked, the silk of her gown hanging below her like the plumage of some strange vertical bird. The fabric swayed with her movements, catching the light from the tall windows, and the train that had been trailing on the floor now hung in mid-air, swinging gently back and forth like a pendulum. She looked, he said, like a creature between a snake and a bird, something sinuous and suspended, not quite one thing and not quite another, moving through the air with a control that was almost frightening in its ease. Christomanos couldn't reconcile what he was seeing with anything he knew about the world he'd entered. This was the woman who sat motionless for 3 hours each morning while her hair was braided. This was the woman who stood in gilded rooms and couldn't bring herself to speak. And here she was, 10 feet off the ground, muscles working visibly beneath the silk, as self-possessed as an acrobat who'd been doing this since childhood. Which, in a sense, she had. And then she dropped. She landed on her feet, barely making a sound, stood for a moment with her hair slightly dishevelled, and her breathing only slightly faster than before, and then she walked to her reading chair, sat down, picked up the volume of Homer they'd been working through and said, "Continue. That's the image I keep coming back to. The Empress on the rings, the silk gown trailing in the air, the quiet landing, the Homer. It's an image that belongs in a novel or a painting or a story told around a fire in a language nobody speaks anymore. And it was real. It happened in a room in the Hofburg, behind a locked door, while the court outside went about its endless business of audiences and kerkels and formal dinners, and nobody, not the Obersthofmeisterin, not the ministers, not the ambassadors, had the slightest idea that the Kaiserin was hanging from iron rings in a silk dress 40 feet away. The newspapers, when they eventually found out about the equipment, assumed it belonged to the emperor or the archdukes. That was the only explanation that made sense to them. Gymnastics was a male pursuit, something soldiers did, something that involved sweat and exertion, and the kind of physical effort that no respectable woman would admit to. The idea that it was the Kaiserin herself in her private rooms, swinging from ceiling-mounted rings like a circus performer, was so far outside the realm of the imaginable that nobody imagined it. The court kept the secret, the workmen kept the secret, and Elizabeth kept exercising day after day, year after year, building a body that could do things no other woman in the palace could do. She swam too whenever the opportunity arose, in the sea at Corfu, in the lakes she found on her travels, in cold water that made her attendants shudder. She was a strong swimmer, had been since the Starnberger Sea, and the water was one of the few places where she could move freely, without a corset, without a gown, without someone standing behind her noting the time. She jumped rope. She was good at it, fast, precise, rhythmic. The rope whistling through the air in a blur, her feet barely leaving the ground, her breathing steady, with a stamina that came from years of practice, and a childhood spent leaping over fences and ditches in Bavaria. My father wanted us to jump like chamois, she told Christomanos, and it was true. Duke Max had turned his children into athletes before they were old enough to know what the word meant. The jumping went on long after Possenhofen. In her 40s, in her 50s, behind locked doors in palaces across Europe, the Empress of Austria was skipping rope in her dressing gown, while her household staff tiptoed past her door and pretended not to hear the rhythmic slap of the rope against the polished floor. She fenced. Not as a hobby, not as a graceful feminine amusement, but seriously with a master, in protective gear, with a real foil. The fencing lessons happened in the afternoon, usually after the midday meal, or what passed for a meal, which we'll get to, and they were conducted with the same intensity she brought to everything physical. She wanted to be good. Not decoratively good, not good for a woman good, but actually good, the way a cavalry officer might be good, with speed and precision and the kind of reflexes that come from hundreds of hours of practice. Whether she achieved this is hard to say. Her fencing master was unlikely to write honestly about beating the Empress. But the fact that she kept at it, year after year, well into middle age, suggests that the sword gave her something the court couldn't. Speed, perhaps. The clean simplicity of attack and defence. A world where the only thing that mattered was the point of the blade and the reflexes of the body behind it. She rode too, of course. She'd been riding since Possenhofen, since before she could read properly, and she was, by the consensus of everyone who saw her, one of the finest horsewomen in Europe. She rode side saddle, as protocol demanded, but she rode at speeds that made her grooms cross themselves. She took fences that experienced cavalrymen refused. She hunted with the English aristocracy during her stays in Ireland and Northamptonshire, and kept up with men who'd been riding to hounds since boyhood. Her riding was the one physical activity the court couldn't entirely hide or deny, because it happened in public, and people saw her, and the sight of the Kaiserin clearing a 4-foot hedge at full gallop was not something you forgot easily. And then there were the walks, the Gewaltmarsch, the forced march. This was the part of Elizabeth's physical regime that the court dreaded most, because it involved other people, and the other people couldn't keep up. She walked for hours. Not strolled, not ambled, not took a pleasant turn through the gardens. She walked the way a soldier walks on a long march, fast, relentless, mile after mile, through the parks around Schönbrunn, through the Vienna woods where the beech trees stood so thick the afternoon light barely reached the path, through the streets of whatever city she happened to be staying in, with a pace that left her ladies-in-waiting gasping and stumbling and, on more than one occasion, in tears. 5 hours was routine. 6 or 7 wasn't unusual. 8 happened. She carried a small fan and sometimes an umbrella, and she wore boots that were heavier and sturdier than anything the fashion of the day considered appropriate for a woman of rank. She walked in all weather. Rain, cold, wind. The heavy summer heat that turned the Vienna streets into ovens, the early spring mud that turned the paths through the Prater into something closer to a ploughed field. She walked until her shoes wore through. She walked until the women assigned to accompany her begged to be reassigned, because an afternoon with the Kaiserin was more physically demanding than anything else the court could throw at them. The ladies were not built for this. They were aristocratic women in their 20s and 30s, laced into corsets, wearing shoes designed for drawing rooms, trained from childhood to move slowly and gracefully and never break a sweat where anyone might see. Being assigned to walk with Elizabeth was, by all accounts, a form of quiet punishment that circulated through the household like a dreaded duty roster. You couldn't refuse, she was the Kaiserin, and you couldn't complain, because complaints had a way of reaching Sophie, and Sophie's response to complaints about her daughter-in-law was unpredictable at best. So you laced your boots as tight as they'd go, and you pinned your hat against the wind, and you took a breath, and you set out into the Prater or the Wienerwald beside a woman who moved through the landscape like something wild and untamed, and you tried to keep up. You walked until your feet blistered. You walked until your corset dug into your ribs so deeply you could feel the bruises forming. You walked until the sweat ran down your back and soaked through your chemise, and your muscles burned and you couldn't feel your toes. And when you couldn't keep up anymore, you fell behind, and you sat on a bench or a fallen tree and caught your breath, and you walked back alone, slowly, and you didn't say a word about it to anyone who mattered. There's something about these walks that goes deeper than exercise. Elizabeth wasn't walking for fitness, or not only for fitness, she was walking to get away. The Gewaltmarsch was movement at its most fundamental. One foot in front of the other, fast enough that nobody could talk to her, far enough that the palace became a distant thing behind the trees, long enough that the schedule broke and the appointments were missed, and the Oberstofmeisterin had to send someone to find her and couldn't. Walking was the one form of freedom that didn't require permission. She couldn't leave the country without arrangements. She couldn't travel without an entourage. She couldn't ride without grooms and attendants following at a respectful distance. But she could walk. She could walk out the door and keep walking, and as long as she came back eventually, there was nothing anyone could do about the hours she'd spent outside the reach of the machine. Now let's talk about what she ate, or rather, what she didn't eat. The diet was extreme. Breakfast was a glass of raw beef broth, the juice pressed from fresh meat through a special device kept in the imperial kitchen, warm, slightly bloody, with nothing added, no salt, no seasoning, just the pure liquid squeezed from raw beef. Sometimes milk instead, cold from the dairy, or a glass of fresh orange juice brought up from the orangery. That was all. No bread, no eggs, no pastry, no butter, nothing solid. The morning would pass. 3 hours of hairdressing, an hour of dressing, the gymnastics, the fencing, on nothing but a glass of liquid and the remnants of whatever she'd eaten the night before, which wasn't much. Lunch she often skipped entirely. When she did eat at midday, the meal was barely recognisable as a meal. A few egg whites, 5 or 6 of them, beaten and salted, nothing else. Or another glass of pressed meat juice, or a cup of consommé, thin and clear, sipped slowly in her private rooms while the rest of the court sat down to a formal luncheon of 6 or 7 courses. She had scales on her dining table, not hidden, not apologised for. The scales sat there, visible to anyone who entered, and she weighed her food before she ate it, the way a pharmacist weighs medicine, precisely, carefully, with full awareness that the wrong dose could do damage. Dinner was the one meal she shared with the Emperor. It was the only time in the day they reliably saw each other. Franz Joseph worked from dawn until late afternoon in his study, and Elizabeth's schedule of grooming and exercise and walking kept her away from his orbit for the rest. At 7 o'clock they sat down together, usually alone, sometimes with family, at a table that was laid with the full apparatus of the imperial household. Silver, crystal, porcelain bearing the Habsburg eagle, footmen standing behind each chair. The kitchen sent up course after course, soup, fish, roast, game, sweets, and Elizabeth ate almost nothing. She picked at a plate. She moved food around. She took a spoonful of sherbet. Violet sherbet was her favourite, a pale purple ice flavoured with the flowers that grew in the gardens at Schönbrunn, sweet and cold and fragrant, dissolving on the tongue like a whisper of spring, and let it sit there for a moment before swallowing. It was the only part of dinner she seemed to enjoy. The rest was performance, endured rather than experienced, a necessary appearance at a table she'd rather have avoided. Franz Joseph, who ate simply but thoroughly, watched this performance with the helpless worry of a man who loves someone he can't reach. He said nothing about it in public. In private, he mentioned it in letters, her appetite, her thinness, the difficulty of feeding a woman who didn't want to be fed. I don't know what to do with this, honestly. The diet was, by any modern understanding, disordered. The compulsive weighing, the skipped meals, the obsessive tracking of every kilogram gained or lost, the way a single fluctuation could send her spiralling into a round of compensatory restriction. These are patterns we'd recognise now. Patterns with names and clinical descriptions and treatment protocols. But she lived in a world that didn't have those names, and the people around her, the court physicians, the ladies in waiting, the Emperor himself, saw what they saw and didn't know what to call it. They called it discipline. They called it willpower. They called it the Kaiserin's extraordinary self-control, and they admired it, or they worried about it, but they didn't intervene, because you didn't intervene with the Empress of Austria. You watched, you noted, you wrote it down in your diary, and you set another place at the table and hoped she'd eat. What strikes me is the way all of it, the gymnastics, the fencing, the walking, the hunger, formed a single system. It wasn't a collection of separate habits. It was an architecture of control built brick by brick over decades, designed to do one thing: keep her body in a state that she, and only she, had defined. The court controlled her schedule. Sophie controlled her children. The protocol controlled her hands, her words, her movements through a room. But the body was hers. The 50-centimetre waist was hers. The muscles that let her hang from the rings were hers. The stamina that carried her through 8 hours of walking in the rain was hers. Nobody had given her permission to build any of it, and nobody could take it away. There's a cost to that kind of control, and the cost was visible to anyone who looked closely enough. She was thin in a way that worried people. Her face, beneath the veal masks and the strawberry treatments, was drawn and pale. She was tired, the deep, hollow tiredness of someone who isn't eating enough to fuel the extraordinary demands she was placing on her body. The energy came from somewhere, and the somewhere was her own reserves, and the reserves were running low. But she kept going. She kept hanging from the rings. She kept walking through the rain. She kept pressing meat juice through a cloth and drinking it warm and calling it breakfast. The locked doors of the gymnastics room, the rope slapping the parquet, the rings swinging slowly to a stop after the Empress had let go and walked away. These were the sounds of a woman who'd found the one territory the court couldn't colonize, and who was defending it with everything she had, even if what she had was slowly becoming less. Here, then, is the day, the finished thing, the schedule that Elisabeth's life eventually became, after the tears and the resistance and the long struggle to hold on to something of Possenhofen had finally been ground down by the machinery of the Viennese court. Here is what a day looked like when the cage was complete. She woke at 5 o'clock in summer, 6 in winter. The palace was still dark at that hour. The footmen hadn't yet lit the lamps in the corridors, and the only light in her bedroom came from the small night lamp that burned on a table beside the door, and the faint grey glow coming through the curtains from the courtyard below. She rose immediately. She didn't linger in bed, didn't allow herself the slow drifting that most people do between sleep and waking. She got up the way a soldier gets up, fast, clean, as though the day were a duty that had already begun. The cold bath came first, not cool, not tepid, cold. The water was drawn from the palace cisterns and left unheated, and she climbed into it and stayed there long enough to feel the shock move through her body from the surface of her skin to the centre of her chest. The gasp that came with the first immersion, that involuntary intake of breath when cold water closes over warm skin, was the first real sound of her day. Everything before it had been silence and movement in the dark. The bath was the threshold. She believed it was good for the circulation, good for the skin, good for the discipline that held the rest of the day together. The Kammermädchen who prepared the bath stood nearby with towels warmed by the stove, saying nothing, because at 5 in the morning in a room full of cold water there was nothing useful to say. They waited. She emerged. The towels went around her. The day had begun. After the bath came a massage, then gymnastics, the rings, the parallel bars, the rope, whatever the body felt like doing that morning, for 30 or 40 minutes, in the private room behind the locked door. Then the light breakfast, a glass of pressed beef juice or cold milk drunk standing up, in less time than it takes to describe. And then the chair. 3 hours in the chair, Fanny behind her, or Fanny's substitute if Fanny was indisposed. The combing, the braiding, the elaborate architecture of the Steckbrief frisure rising slowly on her head, while she studied Hungarian verbs or listened to Christomanos, read the Odyssey, or simply sat with her eyes closed and let the rhythm of the brush carry her somewhere that wasn't here. The mirror in front of her. The mirrors on either side. Herself reflected back from 3 angles. The same face, the same hair, the same white dressing gown multiplied and infinite. When the hair was done, the dressing began. The corset, the lacing, the deerskin underneath and the silk on top and the stitching of the seams and the pinning of the jewels and the careful adjustment of every fold until the reflection in the mirror showed what the court expected to see. Not a person, but a figure, an image, the Kaiserin in full regalia, immaculate and still. An hour for this, sometimes longer. By the time it was finished, the morning was gone. Half the day had passed and she hadn't left her rooms. Then the physical work. On most days, she changed again, out of the formal dress and into a fencing jacket or a riding habit, which had to be sewn onto her body just like the court gown, because even in exercise she couldn't tolerate looseness. The fencing lesson lasted an hour, maybe more. The riding took longer. She'd be out in the Prater or the gardens for 2 hours, sometimes 3, at speeds that made the grooms who followed her grip their reins and pray. She came back windblown and flushed and, for a brief period, something close to happy. The physical exertion gave her what nothing else in the palace could, a sense of being inside her own body, of occupying it fully, of moving through the world as a living thing rather than an ornament. Lunch was nothing. A bowl of clear broth, eaten alone in her rooms in a few minutes, the spoon barely touching the surface of the liquid before she pushed it away. Or the egg whites, beaten and salted, or just another glass of juice. The meal was over before the clock had moved 5 minutes. Then the boots went on and the walking began. 3 hours, 4, 5. Through the Wienerwald if she was at Schönbrunn, through the Ring and the Volksgarten if she was at the Hofburg, through whatever landscape was available, at whatever speed her body could sustain, which was faster than almost anyone around her could match. The ladies in waiting rotated in and out like exhausted relay runners. She walked through all of them. She walked until the shadows lengthened and the air cooled and the schedule demanded she come back and become the Kaiserin again. 5 o'clock, back to the rooms, back to the chair. The second hairdressing of the day, shorter than the morning session but still substantial, because the exertion of the afternoon had loosened the braids and the pins and the careful arrangement that Fanny had spent 3 hours constructing. The hair had to be redone, the dress had to be changed, the jewels had to come out of the vault again, different ones this time, evening pieces, the diamond stars that would sit in her hair at the Hofball, or the emerald drops that would catch the candlelight at the state dinner. Another hour of standing still, another hour of other people's hands on her body, fastening, adjusting, stitching, pinning. 7 o'clock, dinner. This was the only time she saw him, the only hour in the entire day when Elizabeth and Franz Joseph were reliably in the same room, at the same table, facing each other across the silver and the crystal and the porcelain eagles. He'd been working since dawn, reading dispatches, receiving ministers, signing documents, managing the sprawling, fractious, endlessly complicated empire that was his to hold together. She'd been grooming and exercising and walking since before the sun was up. They met in the evening like two people who live in the same building but on different floors, connected by proximity but separated by everything else. He loved her. That's the thing that makes this hard to think about. He loved her with a steadiness that nothing could shake. Not her absences, not her coldness, not her refusal to eat, not the years when she was travelling and he was alone in the Hofburg, eating dinner by himself in a room meant for two, writing her letters full of loneliness and weather reports and small news about the dogs. Your lonely Männl, he signed them. Your little lonely man. It was the most human thing about him. This tenderness that broke through the uniform and the protocol and the rigid self-discipline of a man who'd been running an empire since he was 18. He didn't understand her. He couldn't possibly have understood her. He was a man who found the protocol comforting, who liked the regularity, who experienced the machinery of the court not as a cage, but as a structure that made the world manageable. He got up at 4 a.m, he worked at his desk, he went to bed at 9. He wore the same kind of uniform every day, he ate the same kind of meal. The predictability of it sustained him the way fresh air sustained Elizabeth, and the gap between those two needs, his need for structure and her need for escape, was the gap their marriage fell into. At dinner, he watched her not eat. He made conversation. He asked about her day, and she answered briefly, because what could she say? I hung from the rings. I walked for 5 hours. I drank a glass of beef juice and called it lunch. These were not the conversations of a normal marriage, and they both knew it, and they sat there anyway, because 7 o'clock was when they were supposed to sit there, and the protocol had them for another hour before she could retreat. After dinner, she withdrew. This was the one part of the day that was entirely, genuinely hers. The brief stretch between the end of the formal evening and the beginning of sleep, when the doors of her private apartments closed and the world outside them finally, blessedly stopped. And in that quiet hour there was Ida. Ida Ferenczi was Hungarian. She was younger than Elizabeth, devoted to her with a loyalty that had nothing to do with Sophie or the court or the elaborate hierarchies that governed every other relationship in the palace. She'd come into Elizabeth's service through the Hungarian connection. Elizabeth's deepening love of Hungary and the Hungarian people had opened a door that Sophie's system couldn't close, and Ida had walked through it and stayed. She was a companion, a confidant, a friend in the truest sense the word can bear in a place where friendship was regulated and surveilled. She didn't answer to Sophie. She didn't report to the Obersthofmeisterin. She was Elizabeth's, chosen by Elizabeth, and that simple fact made her the most important person in the Empress's private world. It was Ida who unbraided the hair at night, not Fanny. Fanny's shift ended after the evening hairdressing, and the morning's work was hers, but the undoing of the braids belonged to Ida. She'd sit behind Elizabeth in the quiet of the private rooms, pulling pins and unwinding plaits, letting the heavy mass of chestnut hair fall loose, section by section, until it hung free down Elizabeth's back and pooled in her lap, and the weight of it lifted from her skull, and the ache in her temples slowly eased. They talked during this, softly, in the way you talk when it's late and the house is dark and you're the only two people still awake. They talked about Hungary, the language Elizabeth was slowly mastering, the people she'd grown to love, the country that had given her what Austria never could, which was the feeling of being wanted for herself rather than for her crown. They talked about horses. They talked about the small absurdities of the day, the ambassador who'd sweated through his collar during his audience, the Hofdame who'd tripped on her own train in the corridor, the cook who'd sent up the wrong sherbet and caused a minor crisis in the kitchen that rippled all the way up to the Obersthofmeisterin's office. They talk the way friends talk, without protocol, without rank, without the carefully calibrated distance that every other conversation in Elizabeth's life required. And for that brief hour, the cage opened just wide enough for something real to pass through. Then bed, the wet cloths around her waist tightening slowly in the dark, the veal mask on the nights when the regime called for it, cold and heavy against her cheekbones, the darkness of the room, thick curtains drawn across the tall windows, the only glow the ember of the night lamp and the faint warmth of the porcelain stove cooling in the corner. The particular silence of a palace at night. Not true silence, never true silence, because 1,400 rooms never quite stop breathing, and somewhere below there were always footsteps, always a door opening and closing at the far end of a corridor, always a distant murmur of servants changing shifts, or a watchman making his rounds through the courtyards. She lay in the dark and waited for sleep, and sometimes sleep came, and sometimes it didn't, and either way the morning would arrive at 5 o'clock, and the cold bath would be drawn, and the day would begin again, identical to the one before, and the one before that, and the one before that. She called all official duties an interruption to the schedule. Think about that. Audiences with ambassadors, receptions for visiting royalty, state dinners attended by the heads of allied nations. These weren't the purpose of her day. They were annoyances. They were things that got in the way of the hair, the exercise, the walking, the long private hours of physical maintenance that had become, over the years, the only structure she recognised as her own. The empire could send its ambassadors, the court could schedule its balls, but the schedule, her schedule, the one built from gymnastics and hunger and Fanny's hands in her hair, came first. At the Hofball, the largest and most important social event of the court calendar, she stood in the centre of the room, diamond stars scattered through her hair, the famous diamond stars, each one pinned at a slightly different angle, catching the light from the chandeliers and throwing it back in tiny sharp bursts, so that her head seemed to burn with a cold white fire, the white gown with the narrow waist, the corsage of emeralds or diamonds pinned across her chest, the Strauss waltzes spinning around her, the orchestra playing from the gallery above, the dancers turning in their hundreds beneath the painted ceilings. And she gazed into the distance, past the dancers, past the chandeliers, past the mirrors that multiplied the room into infinity, and her eyes focused on something that wasn't there. She looked, one observer wrote, as though she were standing alone on a cliff by the sea, watching the waves, while around her the party moved and swirled and sparkled, and she was no part of it. She was present and absent at the same time, there in body and gone in spirit, the most visible person in the room and the most unreachable. Her niece, Marie Larish, came to visit her during one of these periods and tried to find words for what she saw. "You're like Titania," she said, "the fairy queen from Shakespeare, the beautiful immortal who ruled her court of flowers and moonlight with a grace that didn't quite belong to the human world. It was meant as a compliment. It was the kind of thing young women said to beautiful older relatives, a flattery wrapped in a fairy tale." Elizabeth looked at her, and she said, "Not Titania. A seagull locked in a cage. Moa im Kastel." The words are better in German, harder, more compact, with a sharpness that the English can't quite catch. A moa is a common gull, a bird you see on the Baltic coast and the Adriatic, wheeling above the water, riding the wind with a freedom that looks effortless because it is effortless. A castel is a cage, or a box, or a fortress, something with walls and no sky. Put them together and you get the image she chose for herself, the metaphor she reached for when all the others, The rose, the violet, the island of peace, the beacon of light, had been used up by people who didn't know her. She wasn't a fairy queen. She was a seabird trapped indoors, beating its wings against walls it couldn't see through, aching for the wind it could feel but couldn't reach. And the cage was beautiful. That was the cruelest part. It was gilded and painted and hung with silk and lit with 1,000 candles and filled with music by the finest composers of the age. The food was exquisite, even if she didn't eat it. The jewels were magnificent, even if they trapped her in doorways. The rooms were vast and warm and immaculate, and the people in them were dressed in their finest, and the whole glittering apparatus of the Habsburg court existed, in theory, to serve her, to honour her, to make her life as comfortable and as splendid as a human life could be. But comfort isn't freedom, and splendour isn't the same as sky. She knew this. She'd always known it, from the first morning in Schönbrunn when she'd opened her eyes in a room full of silk and realised that the silk was the walls, not the windows. And she went on knowing it for decades, through the hair and the corsets and the forced marches and the locked gymnastics room and the scales on the dining table, and the nights wrapped in wet linen until the knowing had become the quietest, deepest, most unchangeable thing about her. A girl who loved lakes, an empress who couldn't hug her cousins, a woman who hung from iron rings in a silk gown and then sat down to read Homer, a seagull in a cage, and the cage was the most beautiful palace in Europe, and so we leave her there. In the quiet of the Hofburg, in the hour after the hair has been unbraided and the diamonds put away and the doors are finally closed, the palace is settling into its nighttime hum, the watchman's footsteps in the courtyard, the distant clatter of the kitchen closing down, the slow tick of the porcelain stove in the corner of a room that smells of beeswax and cold stone, and the faintest trace of cognac from the morning's hairdressing still caught in the air. She's lying in the dark, somewhere in that enormous building wrapped in damp linen waiting for sleep. And somewhere below her, in the servants' quarters and the back corridors and the narrow staircases that the court never sees, the women who dressed her today are lying in their own beds, their own fingers still cramped from the lacing, their own feet still sore from the Gewaltmarsch, their own corsets finally unlaced and hung over the backs of their chairs, the Kammerfrau, the Kammermädchen, the Hofdame who walked 4 hours through the Wienerwald and said nothing about it, Fanny in her apartment with Hugo, her hands smelling of hair oil and adhesive tape, Ida, already asleep, the only person in the palace who'd touched Elisabeth today without protocol telling her how. We don't know their dreams, we don't know what they thought, at the end of a day spent dressing and undressing and lacing and unlacing and walking and waiting and standing in silence behind a woman who was the most looked at person in the empire and the loneliest. They left very few words behind. They weren't the kind of people whose words get kept, but they were there, every day, their hands on the laces, their feet on the paths, their silence holding up the silence of the woman they served. And I think about them tonight the way I think about her. Not with pity exactly, but with the quiet attention that comes from sitting with someone's life long enough to feel the weight of it. You're lying somewhere too right now. Somewhere warm, I hope. Somewhere the air is still and the light is low and nobody is asking you to stand up straight or hold your hands a certain way or speak first in a room full of strangers. Whatever your own version of the cage looks like, and we all have one, even if ours aren't made of gold, tonight it's far away. Tonight there's just this, the dark, the quiet, the slow unwinding of everything that held you upright today. If something from tonight's story stayed with you, the roses on the Danube, the 3 hours of hair, the seagull in the cage, and you'd like to say what it was, the comments are always open. I'd like to hear it. There's no hurry. It can wait until morning. This channel is a quiet place. We tell stories here, slow ones, long ones, stories about medieval kitchens and Victorian parlours and Roman villas, and now an Austrian palace where a girl from a lake became an empress who couldn't hug her cousins. We'll keep going. There are more centuries to walk through, more lives to sit with, more nights like this one. If you'd like to come along, you're warmly welcome to subscribe so that the next story will be here when you need it. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for listening this far. I hope the story carried you somewhere gentle. Sleep well.